Happy Lent. Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Trulia, and today we're covering an extremely important topic. The non-Chalcedonian schism. Are their holy orders void? A tantalizing question, which we'll be covering with a serious review of the information here and with a serious attitude considering what the stakes are. So to summarize what we are covering, the church has a specific ecclesiology and canonically agreed upon norms pre-schism that the non-Chalcedonian side violated. The non-Chalcedonian schism was initially an episcopal minority that nearly disappeared. But a parallel episcopacy was mainly created by Jacob Baradai. We will get into the actual nitty-gritty, which bishops, how many bishops, their canonicity, and all these things. 6 splinter groups by the 570s were made. 2 are the Oriental Orthodox today. The Oriental Orthodox before the rise of Islam might have been significantly smaller than the Eastern Orthodox. We'll go over the demographics, why this may be the case. And most importantly, as I said before, canonically, only God knows the real answer. I'm not making the claim that I know, but canonically, the Oriental Orthodox episcopacy is invalid categorically for the Syriac Orthodox and the Coptic Orthodox. And this is very concerning, and we'll find that Oriental Orthodox canonical and historical sources state this. So this is something we have to take very seriously. Now, before we get started, what makes this show, Orthodox Christian Theology, possible, what motivates me to put together these lectures for you is the mission in Cambodia. Please support the missionary work at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. My wife and I, my whole family, we came back from our annual mission in Cambodia. We have 3 missionaries there now doing exciting work, and we're looking for more volunteers in the summer. So if you are considering being a missionary, please get into contact or become a missionary at orthomission.com. And also pray for the missionary work at Cambodia, and you could support it at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Now let's get started right after I remind you of one thing. And blessed Valeriu Gafencu, who's certainly among the saints, whether you're evangelizing where you live, whether you're going across the world to a place that is unchurched like Cambodia, anyone who believes but is not a missionary has not yet known the beauty of faith. So let this convict you. If you are following all these theological debates, but you have no longer love for Christ, that you're not taking what you know and bringing it to the world for the salvation of souls. This should be motivating you somewhere, anywhere, anyhow to be a missionary. So remember, anyone who believes but is not a missionary has not yet known the beauty of faith. I want you to know the beauty of faith. Get involved in missions. Now, before I get started, because I feel that a lot of people take things very personally in anything. I could take something personally if it's against Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, or Christianity in general. I want to start really quickly with a personal retrospective so people know what I'm all about, and maybe a new introduction to some of my Oriental Orthodox viewers. I started first reading the Fathers and Scriptures now about 22 years ago, in 2004. I studied history. That's what my degrees are in, my master's degree, particularly in history education. But that's what really got me seriously looking into these things, because they were needed for classes. And my study of history has helped me understand the importance of sources and primary sources and different kinds of secondary sources. So this is something I've been looking at and been now publishing even academically for years. Now, it was my wife was the first to get me seriously thinking about theology. Now, it's not that, right? I was reading the Fathers before then. I was reading history before then. But my wife was attending a serious Calvinist church, First Presbyterian, Schenectady, New York. And for the first time, I was challenged, well, there's differences, significant differences between denominations, theology, and first started thinking about theology in a careful, systematic way. Now, years later, my wife became a U.S. citizen in 2015. That's what that cool picture is there, sort of in the middle. And I remember we had to go to the USCIS in New York City, and there was a food truck outside the building there, and a very kind Coptic Orthodox person selling, the rice and chicken, and it was really good. But again, very pious, very nice, spoke very nicely about his faith, and left nothing but a good impression with us. Versus you'll get the Muslims that sell the rice and chicken in New York City, and they're horrible to deal with. So it's night and day to deal with a Christian versus a Muslim in New York City with this. And so the reason I bring that up is all of our impressions thus far is just positive of the Coptic Orthodox, the Syriac Orthodox. We knew they existed, but we were happy Protestants in 2017 when we became Orthodox. And our closest church was a Caroline church. And with pains, we opted not looking to be catechized by the Carolines. And it's because we really like the Indian food. And we actually knew some of the Caroline Orthodox from a local restaurant, but it was due to the schism. So even not being a Orthodox Christian, I knew historically that they were the side in schism. And that was the factor 9 years ago, why not to become a Syriac Orthodox with the Carolines. And so this is years later, me putting together a lecture on the history of the topic, but I just wanted to get out of the way some the personal things that might not be in a lecture like this, where I can speak for the family. We have no ill will, nothing negative against the Oriental Orthodox, but the schism has been for years a concern of ours and a deal breaker, at least in my family. Now, I want to preempt some bad polemics with context. Now, I'm trying my best with English language sources. People might pull out, well, haven't you have an AI translated this thing in Arabic? I certainly have not, because I'm not dealing with that. So please forgive me. I'm trying to put together something pretty thorough, but with English language sources. I want people to be aware when polemicists don't have the facts, they'll rely on personal attacks. They'll say that you're lying. They'll make all these allegations, but they won't prove their case. They'll make appeals to endless specificity. So they'll say, well, it's not specific enough, what you said, or there's only so much I'm going to get done now in the next hour and a half, right? So follow up on the sources I do provide and see that I'm telling the truth. I'm trying to put together a presentation that is worthwhile, but also is not going to take 10 hours to do. So look into it yourself instead of making this appeal and calling me a liar or something. They'll also say, oh, you made one error here because there's 130 slides. You got this one thing wrong in this one slide. That means everything's wrong. Well, clearly that's a fallacy. Everyone makes mistakes. They also will make ad hocs or non sequiturs. So you didn't talk about this topic, or there's some reason I could conjure up here, but we have to look at what's the most compelling interpretation, the evidence. And I think people will see I've done due diligence in this presentation precisely on that. I want to quote St. Paul. The scripture warns, note those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and avoid them. For those who are such do not serve our Lord. So whether they're Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, Oriental Orthodox, Roman Catholic, whatever they are, and they're always constantly stirring passions and starting fights, and they're causing divisions and they're teaching heresies, well, note those people and avoid them because they're not serving God. I'm here to help build up the Cambodian mission and hopefully bless you some of the information here. I'm not here to stir passions or to cause divisions among people, but there are those who are because it's profitable for them. Avoid those people. They do not serve God. Now let's get into it. The history of schisms and depositions, all right? So this is the first thing we got to start with. There have been schisms, obviously, before Chalcedon. Tertullian, with the Priscillianist, became a schismatic over penances, thinking that his patriarchate, which was the Roman one, was giving out penances too easily to adulterers and this and that. And he went into schism. But he didn't really he really wasn't part of a very large church body. It's not even entirely clear how much he was involved with the Priscillianists and stuff like that. But we have a better example, the Novatians over penances for the lapsed. And with the Novatians, they created a parallel bishop of Rome, which is really how it started. But then they created parallel bishops throughout the Mediterranean world. They lasted for centuries. There's canons on how we receive back Novatianists. There was a schism with St. Stephen of Rome and with Gnostic baptisms where he didn't create, there's no parallel jurisdictions over this, but St. Stephen didn't accept the majority view of baptism, and he walled himself off from other jurisdictions other than Alexandria. And we had the Meletians, a different kind of, not Meletius of Antioch, but Meletius in Egypt, and the Donatists, who also had schisms, overlapped clergy, and created parallel jurisdictions. And that's the important thing to emphasize here. We have examples of parallel jurisdictions and how the church deals with these guys, with the Novatians, the Donatists, and the Meletians. And they're all categorically condemned for creating parallel jurisdictions. So for Chalcedon, it's well known, this is problematic. You can't have a second bishop. You can't create a second altar within a city. Now, in the Arian controversy and there were schisms, there's some odd stereotypes out there, so I'm going to counter those and push back a little bit and say the Nicene side didn't create schisms. We don't have examples of this. Like, for example, yes, there's a second bishop of Alexandria, a second bishop of Antioch, but Meletius and Athanasius, right, the Nicene bishops, were the majority of their own synods. We're going to find that's actually very important because that's a canonical standard for vindicating who's the correct metropolitan or patriarch. All right. They had the majority of their own synods, which implies their elections were legitimate, canonically speaking. The parallel episcopacy is among those who are elected by the minority, right? Like Paulinus of Antioch. And it's all parallel to the majority choice. So we're going to have to pay attention to this because this is what's true during the Arian controversy. What is true after Chalcedon? This is very important. Now, I'm going to say this in quotation marks. We're going to get into depositions, and there's a canonical way to do depositions, but the problem is there's no canon delineated whether or not, let's say, the deposition of Athanasius was correct or not. There is no canon on it, but there is a tradition that's effectually canonical, right? Because we've had many patriarchal depositions and recognitions, so to say, that form an authoritative tradition. Just like the sinlessness of the Theotokos, there's no canon and no ecumenical council on that question, but that's authoritative for us. So is this question of how to properly depose and recognize a patriarch. So with Polycrates of Ephesus and Victor of Rome, the world recognized Polycrates and the Ephesian Patriarchate. And so this is a precedent in the 2nd century. We have St. Cornelius of Rome, the Pope, and Novatian, who's the real Bishop of Rome, because both claim to be consecrated Bishop of Rome. Well, the majority of the Roman Synod accepted Cornelius. The majority of his patriarchate accepted Cornelius. The world received Cornelius' letter. The world rejected Novatian, which is why Novatian then went and appointed other bishops. So we have a tradition there which vindicates the majority choice. We have St. Athanasius versus the world. As St. Jerome says, Athanasius versus the world. But the reality is that whoever was against Athanasius never had the world's patriarchs recognizing them. But with Athanasius, he did have the world's patriarchs recognize him before his disputed depositions. He never had a consensus deposition. You need all the patriarchs to depose a patriarch. You can't just do it with one or two. And so particularly Rome, but also Jerusalem, they were very supportive of Athanasius, and that kind of shielded him from the machinations of Constantinople. We also have Meletius versus Paulinus, which is a good example where neither in their lifetimes ever got the consensus of anyone, but Meletius, after death through St. Flavian, eventually got the recognition of everyone, which shows you which side was vindicated, the side where all the patriarchates recognized that particular patriarch. And so we do have a canonical tradition, so to say, that's not a canon, but an authoritative tradition before Chalcedon on that question. And it was so well known, there's a synod essentially among the Syrian Church of the East in 424 of Mark Copta, and they recognized it and took it for granted. So to quote the Synod, as for what was defined by the Western Fathers, i.e. the 5 patriarchs in the Roman world, that it is not permitted for bishops to hold an assembly against their leader, nor to write charges or reproaches, but that if they have to complain and do not obtain satisfaction in the council in the presence of the patriarch, they must appeal to his colleagues, i.e. the other patriarchs, who will decide between him and them after having examined the matter. So here is a synod, a local jurisdictional synod among the Syrians, and they go, well, this is what the rest of the whole Christian world believes. Now, they were to take issue with it because they didn't want their patriarch to be appealed to the patriarch of Antioch. But this shows you they're the minority in opposing this. This was the recognized tradition of the whole Christian world. That's why the Syrians eventually went into schism. And so it's not just, oh, look, Craig's an apologist making this up out of nowhere. No, this is in the primary sources, and they took for granted this is the majority view of everybody. Now, it gets even better than this. We have a source that is actually canonical for Oriental Orthodox today, the Fether Negest. And it is the normal canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and it's based upon a 13th century Coptic normal canon. It is still canon law today, as I said, for the Ethiopian Orthodox. It has an introduction written by the Selassie, however you pronounce his name, but like the king of Ethiopia, the last emperor of Ethiopia. And it's cited today against the Eritreans. So the Ethiopian Orthodox still cite this document because it is their canon law. And what does it say? It says, if a patriarch is guilty of some offense, no proceeding may take place, that's their brackets, not mine, unless one of his fellow 3 patriarchs takes part in the accusation and the inquiry into the matter. So as you can see, it doesn't get to the same level of detail of the Synod of Mar Kopta or that authoritative tradition we discussed, but you clearly see a patriarch is judged by at least one patriarch in the example they give. Now let's get into the ecclesiastical history of Chalcedon, only ever so briefly. So let's talk about Dioscorus's deposition. This is really not the meat of the presentation, but it's going to come up, so I figured I'd cover it. He had a canonical deposition. So Chalcedon's minutes show evidence of integrity. This is something I think we cannot seriously take issue with. Keyword seriously. People take issue with it, but it's because they don't like what it says. Now, if you read Chalcedon's minutes, it preserves debates from opposing sides. It preserves criticisms of what's going on during the synod. It preserves defenses of Dioscorus himself. It even preserves the notes. Like it writes down them collecting the notes of the transcripts. So it's sort of like not actually people talking, but people say, stack the papers over here and they'll put them over there. Which means it was such a slavish, such a slavish recording of what happened there. You need a lot of evidence to say, well, no, there's something really, really inaccurate in these minutes, because as far as an ancient source goes, these look extremely authentic with the details. They preserve things that are not, the details that are not really, they don't make the Chalcedonian side even look good, quite frankly. It's sometimes a hostile witness is your most accurate witness, and the Chalcedonian minutes definitely are like this. Now, what else do they record that's relevant to us? They record Dioscorus refusing summons 3 times, canonically leading to his deposition. And that's extremely important. All right. He was canonically deposed because the canons. What are the canons? Here's Apostolic Canon 74. If any bishop has been accused of anything by men worthy of credit, he must be summoned by the bishops. And if he appears and confesses or is convicted, a suitable punishment must be inflicted upon him. But if when he is summoned, he does not attend, let him be summoned a second time, 2 bishops being sent to him for that purpose. If then he will not attend, let him be summoned a 3rd time, 2 bishops being again sent to him. But if even then he shall disregard the summons and not come, let the synod pronounce such sentence against him as appears right, that he may not seem to be to profit by avoiding judgment. All right, so you could see that after 3 summons, they could depose the patriarch there, or any bishop. We also have Canon 5 of Antioch, which applies the same to a priest or deacon. If any priest or deacon despises his bishop and separates himself from the church by gathering a congregation privately and setting up an altar, his bishop should summon him. If he refuses to submit even after his bishop summons him a first and a second time, the bishop must dismiss him from the clergy with no possibility of reinstatement to his position or rank. If he continues to disturb the church, the state should discipline him as a seditious person. All right, so we could see that we have the summons there in another canon. My opinion is canon 74 of the apostolic canons was the actual canon in force. But Oriental Orthodox canon law still preserves this tradition, and it's not a canonical exegesis on my behalf. We have this in the Feth and Agest. If a bishop is accused by a reliable and faithful person, and he refuses to come, they shall send to him an envoy representing the bishops, either once or twice, and if he refuses, they shall send an envoy for the third time. If he does not come, the council of bishops shall order his deposition. So, of course, there should be no debate. Dioscorus was canonically deposed. He was no longer patriarch. His deposition was accepted by all patriarchs in Chalcedon, meeting that standard, and his own synod. This is important, and his own synod, because they didn't fight to the death resisting his deposition, but they were willing to die to not sign the decree of the council until they went back to Egypt. All right, they were willing to die until they could replace Dioscorus, not to sign that decree. So they weren't in opposition to the deposition. They're in opposition of signing the decree prematurely. So this gives a good understanding of what the church in Alexandria understood to be legitimate or not. So what was the Egyptian Synod's dying words? What were they willing to die for? It states this in the council, quoting them. But since the most religious bishops of our diocese happen to be very many, while we, being easy to count, are not able to represent them, meaning all of them, we entreat your preeminence in this holy and great council to have pity on us and wait for our archbishop so that we may follow his decision according to ancient custom. But if we do anything without the approval of our leader, the whole Egyptian diocese will attack us and acting uncanonically. All right. And so it continues. The most God-beloved Archbishop Anatolius, they say, knows that the custom that has prevailed in the Egyptian diocese is that all the bishops obey the Archbishop of Alexandria. We are not disobeying the council, but we shall be killed in our native land. Have pity on us. You have the power. We submit. We do not disobey. It is preferable for us to die at the hands of the master of the world, i.e. the emperor, of your preeminence and of the Holy Council, than there in Egypt. Let us have an archbishop, and we shall sign an assent to Chalcedon. So as we can see, the Egyptian Synod, in their words, and very believable words, feared domestic violence more. Clearly, they're throwing themselves at the mercy of the side that think that's actually going to let them go and not kill them. So what do we know to be the consent of the Egyptian Synod? Consent that's derived by being fear of death in Alexandria, or the consent they gave to leaving Chalcedon, getting a new patriarch, and then accepting the council. Obviously, the consent that's more legitimate is to the less violent side. Now, obviously, there's more than a small degree of intimidation in Constantinople itself, in Chalcedon, because that's what's coming up those words. But there is no less, in fact, much more back in Egypt. And so the question is, all right, there's intimidation on both sides. How do we know what people are really consenting to? The logical answer to that question is the side they're less afraid of is the side they're giving more authentic consent to. So it's to Chalcedon that the Egyptian Synod gave more authentic consent. So what occurred after Chalcedon? They elected St. Proteus of Alexandria to the Alexandrian Patriarchate, and they accepted Chalcedon. That's what occurred. All right. Almost no Egyptian bishops actively opposed Chalcedon. Now, you'll have Roman Catholic apologists, Oriental apologists, and they'll claim Chalcedon was never really fully accepted. Let's quote Timothy of Alexandria, Timothy the Cat. He says, all the bishops, so this is quoting a non-Chalcedonian, all the bishops were denying faith in our Lord and dividing him into two natures. Dioscorus was the one true archbishop who had zeal for the blasphemed Christ. So he admits the synods all accepted Chalcedon. He says all the bishops. Now, it's a bit of an exaggeration. There's like one or two, because the ones that consecrated him that didn't. But he accepts that the Egyptian synod accepted Chalcedon. So this should put that idea to rest, that Chalcedon lacked consensus. We have proof that it had consensus. We have the people against Chalcedon accepting that Chalcedon had consensus. So that said, Timothy the Cat, as I was referring to before, was a consecrated a non-Chalcedonian anti-patriarch, because St. Proterus was already patriarch, by two bishops, Eusebius of Pelsium and Peter the Iberian, the latter not even an Egyptian. There was no patriarchal acceptance of his bishopric, and this violates the canons and, as we talked about before, precedent, because we lack patriarchal acceptance of him, which we had for all the other undisputed patriarchs. And the history of the previous schisms, the side without this was the side in schism. So that being said, let's look at the canons themselves. We have Canon 4 of Nicaea. It states that it is by all means proper that a bishop should be appointed by all the bishops in the province. But should this be difficult, either on account of urgent necessity or because of distance, 3 at least should meet together. And the suffrages of the absent bishops also being given and communicated in writing, then the ordination should take place. But in every province, and the ratification of what is done should be left to the metropolitan. So this implies clearly greater reception of a patriarch. By default, it should be consensus. If an emergency, at least 3 people should be present. And what we have is just 2, and one of them is not even an Egyptian. So clearly, Timothy the Cat is not canonical. I mean, that's absolutely clear. We also have the same in Canon 6 of Nicaea, which states, and this is to be universally understood, that if anyone be made bishop without the consent of the metropolitan, the great synod has declared that such a man ought not to be a bishop. If however 2 or 3 bishops shall, from natural love of contradiction, oppose the common suffrage of the rest, it is reasonable in accordance with the ecclesiastical law, then let the choice of the majority prevail. So what is the answer? The majority of a synod decides legitimate bishops, right? You can't have a minority decide this. Canons are very clear. But now let's get into, it's not my eisegesis. The Fetha Nagest talks about patriarchal elections. In fact, gives much more specific details as to what's appropriate. Ethiopian canon law says the following. The election of the patriarch shall take place only in the presence of the bishops and the metropolitan, who is the archbishop. If there is a dispute about his election, it shall be settled in accordance with the advice of the majority. So how do we determine who's the right patriarch? If there's a dispute, the majority decides. It also states the people must know the name, the face, and the character of the person who is to be appointed. It is not that only one of them knows him. So essentially, we can't have secret elections. There's also more detail. For example, it talks about how the one appointed first is the patriarch, if there was 2 elections and things like this. But I think it's suffice to say the majority determines who's patriarch in the Fetha Nagest. Now, let's briefly also discuss, was Chalcedon Orthodox? Because you could say, well, Chalcedon was so terrible, it required violating the canon. So I don't think this is a very compelling argument. It's already a kind of desperate pleading sort of argument, because you don't have the canonical upper hands. Your own canons say you're in violation. So then you have to say, well, we had to break the canons because Chalcedon was so wrong. So ever so briefly, I want to give maybe a good reason you haven't thought about why Chalcedon should be understood to be consistent with the Council of Ephesus, with St. Cyril, with St. Celestine of Rome, and others. So are irregularities justified due to the heterodoxy of Chalcedon? Now, in this video, we are covering ecclesiological history mostly, so only a brief discussion of the context behind Leo and Chalcedon's Christology will be offered here. But it's worth noting that the Council of Ephesus and pre-Chalcedonian saints have dyophysite or two-nature language. The West viewed diophysitism as sufficiently anti-Nestorian. St. Ambrose's diophysitism is even in the Council of Ephesus decree. To quote it, and you can see the actual citation to the Council of Ephesus. Let us preserve the recognition of the Godhead, writes St. Ambrose, and the flesh, the Son of God who speaks in each is one, because each nature is in him. Note in him how the glory of God and how the sufferings of man, that as God he teaches divine things, and that as man he says human things because he spoke in my essence. St. Ambrose here is verbatim quoted in the second tome of Leo, that's letter 165-4. And St. Cyril clearly understood this as Western lingo communicating the same Christology, because here we have a Western saint saying each nature is in Christ and he spoke in human essence after the incarnation, and he takes no issue with essence and nature being used synonymously, of two natures being mentioned. He saw this as sufficiently anti-Nestorian that St. Cyril included this in his Florilegium that's in the council. Now, here is some additional context that you might have not considered, and I was turned on to this by a friend of mine. Now, in the Oxford University Press Early Christian Writings Volume 3 series, it says the following in the introduction. Cyril also provided Celestine with a dossier of Nestorius writings. By mid-430, at the latest, Celestine had tasked his archdeacon Leo, right, the future bishop of Rome, with evaluating them. So whose job, right, whose job was it to inform Celestine whether to oppose Nestorius or not? St. Leo of Rome. Well, when have you heard that from the Oriental Orthodox side? So Leo is the one who's concocting the Christology in opposition to Nestorius. How did Leo do this? Leo in turn requested John Cassian, another saint, to examine the text from Nestorius, produce a document to advise Celestine and the Roman Church about the matter. In his On the Incarnation of the Lord against Nestorius, Cassian firmly rejected Nestorius' position. As the first Latin text to assess Nestorius' theology, this treatise had a profound influence. In August 430, a synod met in Rome under Celestine that formally condemned Nestorius. And so what does this document actually state? In that then they condemned Nestorius. Was this document dyophysite? You bet it was. Quoted in the affirmative, a man named Leporius, who was a Nestorian before Nestorius, when he repented of his adoptionism, he wrote the following, which Cassian quotes and approves of. And confessing both the substance of the flesh and of the word, one and the same God, far be it from us to believe in such a way that we suppose that two natures are reduced into one substance. Repeat. Far be it from us to believe that in such a way that we suppose that two natures are reduced into one substance by a kind of fusion. And thus the word and flesh became one in each other, so that while remaining in their perfection naturally, both substances, without prejudice to themselves, both communicate a divine humanity and participate in human divinity. We faithfully, without any doubt, believe that one and the same Son of God, always inseparable of twin substance, even called a giant in the days of his flesh. All right. So what is the Latin usage of twin substance? That was some discussion during our debate, and I covered this in my video on St. Ambrose. But here we see, again, very clearly, nature's being used and substance being used in the plural. Twin substance is a plural, as I covered in both Plato and in Ambrose. Cassian is quoting approvingly Leporius' recantation of proto-Nestorianism and adoptionism. And just so you're aware, Saints Augustine and Aurelius signed the same recantation. So it's not like just Leporius. Saints signed this in the bottom. And it's quoted by a saint, and it's what was used in order to concoct the anti-Nestorian position of the Roman Church by John Cassian. Now, it commended Leporius back to the Gaulish clergy as repenting of his adoptionism. Leporius is using the term twin substance from Ambrose's repeated interpretation of the giants. Leporius and Cassian explicitly deny that twin substance is one substance. I'm going to repeat this. Leporius and Cassian explicitly deny that twin substance is one substance. That's a quote from what we just read. But rather, to quote it, two natures. I'm going to repeat that. Leporius and Cassian explicitly deny that twin substance is one substance, but rather two natures. This is explicitly quoted in the document that was put together in order to inform the Roman Synod to deny Nestorius before the Council of Ephesus. This is the context of St. Celestine's Christology. So this begs the question, is Chalcedon's clarification legitimate? Leporius' recantation is the basis the West rejected Nestorianism signed to Ephesus, as I just said. Leo's Christology was seen as a continuation of this. After all, Leo is the one who put this together with Cassian. The West had already flattened the usage of the term nature, as we could see. They used nature and substance synonymously before Ephesus, which in my opinion gives like a theological expiration date to language like the natural and essential union, right? Because how can you talk about there's a natural union, there's one nature? I mean, there's a proper way of talking about that, really. But how do you talk about that when you already start using the term substance and nature synonymously? You almost need a new word. And this begs there to be a terminological clarification. I would say it was necessary. So when Eutyches confessed one nature after the union, in the Western theological vocabulary, which we just saw, that would mean one substance after the union, and this is something explicitly denied in Celestine's day by John Cassian. So other terms, like the term hypostasis, had to be used, but even the term hypostasis itself was given this treatment because hypostasis was used originally just to mean substance or essence, but then it was developed and clarified to mean particular essence, like a particular person. That's why we could have the fullness of deity, the full essence of God, but in a particular person, in a particular hypostasis, right? So they developed the vocabulary even past Nicaea because there was like this expiration date. How we talk about these other theological concepts without differentiating between essence and nature and substance and hypostasis. So, of course, you could be making the wrong clarification. And so I'm not going to solve this today, but I will ask the audience this, just use your common sense. Is the side not in schism more capable of making the right judgment call about the clarification? Or is the schismatic side making the right clarification? The right judgment call on a clarification? I'm gonna say the schismatic side's probably wrong. That's my opinion, but I leave that to you to discern. Now, let's get into the Henotikon-Era Ecclesiology, and let's talk about some non-Chalcedonian patriarchs after Chalcedon. Now, the non-Chalcedonians in Egypt had irregular elections after Timothy Salphakilos. He was the undisputed Chalcedonian patriarch for about 20 years because Timothy the cat was never fully recognized. And in fact, when he was made a patriarch supposedly by Basilicus, even Basilicus had reneged on this. So we had Peter Mongus, another non-Chalcedonian, consecrated in secret without a synod. And he accepted the bishopric of Rakot, which is a suburb of Alexandria. And there's actually letters he receives from his allies that call him the Bishop of Rakot. So we accept that he wasn't Patriarch Alexandria because he himself accepted that he wasn't. He accepted he was the Bishop of Rakot. And so he would be later translated or moved to the Patriarch of Alexandria. And how did that occur? John of Talia, the Chalcedonian, was consecrated Bishop of Alexandria, but he was exiled by the Roman Emperor Zeno. So all these stereotypes that, oh, the Chalcedonians were persecuting the non-Chalcedonians, kicking people out. The first canonical person that was actually persecuted by the church is not a non-Chalcedonian. It's a Chalcedonian, John of So that's kind of ignominious, but it's the truth. Now, that being said, he did consent to his translation to being Bishop of Nola in Italy. And the Eastern Patriarchs then accepted Peter. So like Peter Mongus does get regularized. I'm not claiming that Henotikon-Era is this like great bastion of orthodoxy, but this is how this didn't become a greater issue. The canonical patriarch just accepted what occurred, and the non-canonical bishop with a non-canonical translation got everyone's acceptance, and that regularized him. And not to anyone who's been Orthodox a long time would know that there's even with parish priests and stuff, we've seen this with Father Peter Heers with his canonical release. When there's these canonical irregularities, eventually things could be regularized over time and through everyone's consent. And this is actually what occurred with Peter Mongus. And so that being said, the patriarchs during the Henotikon-Era were generally undisputed, all right? Or actually right before during Henotikon, they were canonically regularized when there was an issue, with the exception of Rome, who didn't accept any of these people, right? So they never got the full patriarchal acceptance, perhaps providentially so. And they were tolerant of each other until John II of Alexandria excommunicated St. Flavian II and Severus, politic to depose him. So the first strike is the first time the government persecuted one of these sides, it was the Chalcedonian side that had their canonical bishop persecuted. The second strike is that even when they kind of made a peace between each other, it was the non-Chalcedonian side that broke the peace. Again, these are just facts. There was this, I would say not even a not uneasy, but like an easy, like live, let live attitude that even intercommunes until John II of Alexandria excommunicated St. Flavian, until Severus deposed him, right? Otherwise, he was not bothering anybody. Now, hyper non-Chalcedonians broke this uneasy truce of the Henotikon, but even then, they were able to selectively accept Chalcedonian communion. So they're kind of inconsistent, and we'll get into this in a second. But I just want to bring up that the days of peace between these both sides wasn't as long as the whole Henotikon-Era. At best, it's 25 years. So that's worth pointing out. So let's talk about some non-Chalcedonian saints, which were in communion with Chalcedonians. Now, St. Flavian II of Antioch, who's a Chalcedonian, was in communion with John I of Alexandria, non-Chalcedonian. And I, just in case, because it's kind of hard to find online, I actually put his saints like in their calendar, what his saint day is. He is a saint. And John I and his deacon, Dioscorus II, who later became Pope of Alexandria, and he's a saint, in 497, were open to communion with Rome if the letter's doctrine, if their own synodical letter was accepted. So I will only briefly get into detail, but they said the Toma Leo in Latin we hear from the Bishop of Thessalonica isn't heretical, unlike the Greek of Chalcedon. So here's our Christological confession. If you accept it, we could have communion. So we could see the Toma Leo wasn't a deal breaker for two more saints of the Coptic Orthodox, John I and Dioscorus II. And John II initially had communion with St. Flavian II, though it's worth pointing out he then broke it because he was a more severe non-Chalcedonian, or a more adamant non-Chalcedonian. Now, Severus of Antioch, who had Flavian II deposed, interestingly enough, was in communion with Timothy I of Constantinople. Now, Timothy I of Constantinople accepted Severus's non-Chalcedonian anathemas, but he also simultaneously accepted Chalcedon, which we could see why Rome would not be in communion with Timothy I of Constantinople. But then it begs the question, how could Severus be in communion with someone who's accepting Chalcedon? So the fact of the matter is, Chalcedon is not the deal breaker that people claim it is if we have non-Chalcedonian saints in communion with Chalcedonians. So that's worth pointing out. And to some degree, non-Chalcedonianism isn't the sort of deal breaker that some people think it is with the Chalcedonian side in communion with them. Even St. Photius, which we have a whole other video on. Perhaps not very prudently, by the way, but worth pointing out, this occurred with both side saints. Now, let's talk about court non-Chalcedonianism and their canonicity. Now, we never talk about this because there's this sort of stereotype that the non-Chalcedonians weren't the Melkites. They weren't the royalist side, but that's totally not true. We saw with Zeno being the first emperor to depose a canonical patriarch for the issue of Chalcedon. Yes, there was political machinations in favor of non-Chalcedonianism, and there was a whole royalist faction among the non-Chalcedonians. And so let's talk about this. There was an end of peace brought, the end of this peace really started by Severus, brought disputed depositions and elections between Chalcedonians and court non-Chalcedonians. The peace, like I said, already ended during the Henotikon. And so there were a lot of people who are non-Chalcedonian, but the ones you only hear about are the court side, the ones that actually had the favor of the royalty in Constantinople. And those people were the minority of non-Chalcedonians. My personal opinion is because the main impetus behind non-Chalcedonianism was resistance to the Roman Empire. So, of course, the side that's non-Chalcedonian that is collaborationist of the Roman Empire is going to be the less popular side. But we'll get to more details. Now, Severian patriarchs all eventually were put under house arrest, but I want to mention they were protected also in Constantinople. We'll get into details of how they're protected. Severus of Antioch and Themis of Constantinople and Theodosius of Alexandria are examples of these men. Now, it begs the question, were they controlled opposition, right? Like they are the royalist non-Chalcedonians. Are they kind of like controlled opposition like Shapiro and Sean Hannity? You know, are they controlled opposition like the Mossad and Hamas? Did you know about this? Hamas was bolstered by the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence, because they were the religious fanatics vis-a-vis the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which were a secular, communist-based resistance to the Israelis. So sometimes a side that's against you will pick one of the two sides that are in opposition to them to weaken them, right? And so were these royalist non-Chalcedonians bolstered by Constantinople to weaken non-Chalcedonianism? I pose the question. I'm not exactly sure, but it's worth considering. Let's talk about divide and conquer versus consolidate and reconcile. Now, you could say, well, if they're controlled opposition, perhaps it's part of divide and conquer strategy, that we could divide the different non-Chalcedonians, get a group we like, and then because they're all splintered, we could take them out one piece at a time, right? Kind of like what the FBI did in the 60s to like the hippies. But there's this other way to look at what they did in Constantinople. Was this consolidate and reconcile? And I think it was consolidate and reconcile. Try to make a group of people that are less crazy and try to bring them together. And it's easier to talk turkey with this group of reasonable people, and then we can all reconcile versus a bunch of raving lunatics and try to reconcile each group of raving lunatics. That's much more difficult. So the quote Hardy in his article, why did Justinian tolerate, or if not, in fact, patronize, right, St. Theodora, court non-Chalcedonianism? Here's what he writes. After a while, the emperor was perhaps not unwilling to the two such sources of power as the loyalty of the Egyptians to their church and the wealth of the See of Alexandria should be in different hands. The Copts, of course, controlled the lesser but considerable resources of dioceses, monasteries, and parish churches outside of Alexandria. We need not ascribe to Justinian a deliberate plan to divide and rule, but he may well have calculated that since the total suppression of the monophysites was unlikely, it was better to keep their leaders in some kind of touch with himself than to drive them into complete opposition. And that's where I think with St. Theodora and Justinian, they're playing good cop, bad cop. And the whole plan all along was to consolidate and to limit the actions of the non-Chalcedonians. And when they did, as we're going to see, did act and consecrate people, to try to do it outside the Roman Empire. And there's canonical reasons for this. That's why I don't think even Theodora is a non-Chalcedonian. I think she's a Chalcedonian saint for good reason, because she was working with St. Justinian to reconcile the non-Chalcedonian side through the court party of the non-Chalcedonians. But let's get into the canons. There's definitely some canonical obscurity in the 530s, and we kind of have to wade through that to get a good idea of which side is in the right, at least canonically speaking. Now, similar to Dioscorus and Silverius of Rome, right? So we have Silverius of Rome was deposed, and Dioscorus Alexander was deposed. We had court non-Chalcedonian patriarchs that had imperial depositions, so they weren't originally deposed by their own synod. They deposed just because the emperor said they're deposed. But the local synods and other patriarchs accepted what the emperor did, and this granted legitimacy. So we don't oppose this because this happened to Dioscorus and everyone accepts this. This happened to Silverius and everyone accepts this. And it's no different with the court non-Chalcedonian patriarchs. Now, the majority of local synods accepted and elected replacements in all cases. I want to point out they're bishops, all right? The majority of local synods bishops accepted, elected replacements, the non-Chalcedonian patriarchs in all cases, all right? This is not something that is disputed. What's disputed is how free were they in doing this, or were they just a bunch of puppets of, let's say, Constantinople, and these weren't free acts of the synods? Now, in my opinion, and I could be wrong, I'm not God, this seems to me based on cooperative synods in response to imperial strong army, right? So like Peter Mongus being translated after John Italia's being kicked out by Zeno. I'm not going to say that Peter Mongus then wasn't legitimately patriarch. I said he was regularized. So there's some strong arming, but then people do go along with strong arming. And we have a modern analog to this, the disease we can't name because it'd get this channel taken down, right? We saw this with synods 5 years ago. So why would this be different hundreds of years ago? There's a difference between outright persecution and strong arming, but people go along with it. And clearly we have strong arming, people go along with it. By the way, there's a big war in Iran right now. No one likes it. No one's in favor of it, but are you stopping it? Are you protesting against it? You're just going along with it. So it's really not illegal. Might be unconstitutional, but it's not illegal. No one's opposing this thing. And so very similarly, people cannot be happy with some of these machinations, but it's kind of irrelevant. They go along with it. And in fact, then they go elect replacements, which is a tacit approval of the deposition. And so that said, full patriarchal acceptance was eventually obtained for these depositions. So Severus' deposition / his abdication in 518 was not recognized by Alexandria until 537 to 538. But the point is, it eventually was. He eventually got full patriarchal acceptance of his deposition. And as I was referring to before, this makes the years 536 to 538 crucial because the events create difficulties for both sides. But only one side ever attains to any full acceptance, and it's the Chalcedonian side. Now, Severus, Anthemus, and Theodosius, those court non-Chalcedonians we're talking about, were all officially deposed or abdicated, and those were all recognized in 536. How did this occur? There was a council held, which was accepted by Constantinople, Rome, and Jerusalem. And the grounds of deposition were they're not Chalcedonian. They had these canonical reasons. So, for example, Anthemus was deposed for a translation that wasn't accepted. And there's canons on episcopal translations, moving seas. And this reminds me of something a monk told me. He said, everyone violates the canons, like Anthemus. So they punish you when they want to. So clearly that's not fair, obviously, right? Like, we'll accept some people's translations, but not yours when it suits us. But that's one of those things, why they put compromised people in positions of power, because then they could take it all away from them. Kind of like those files we can't name without having this video removed, right? The same letters as Epic Fury are those files. But that being said, everyone violates the canons. Everyone breaks the law, but they punish you when they want to. All right? And that is what happened to these non-Chalcedonian patriarchs. Now, let's get into more detail when it comes to each of their situations. So, I'm not just painting with a very broad brush. Now, Severus and Philoxenus constituted, to quote Haywood, a small minority of a synod against St. Flavian II of Antioch in 509. And in Sidon in the 511 synod, the anti-Chalcedonians were no match for their opponents, leading to the emperor disbanding the council. So what's the significance of this? And this is quoted in Haywood's book. That despite imperial supports, they had the emperor behind them. All right? The court non-Chalcedonians were not numerous enough to impose themselves. So who's the majority? Let's be honest. Who's the majority? They were, the Non-Chalcedonians, a small minority. Even with imperial strong-arming, they were still a small minority. Now, to quote the same book, Evagrius, reporting eyewitness events or eyewitness accounts, describes the ensuing violence between anti-Chalcedonian monks who arrived in Antioch from Syria Prima and the largely Chalcedonian populace of the city who slaughtered their opponents. So who is bringing wholesale slaughter to the populace? We don't have this at the Chalcedonian side killing the laity that is not in rebellion. It is like BLM being busted to town. These foreign monks come in support of Severus and start slaughtering the residents of the city. All right, so this is a very ignominious beginning of Severus' rise to the Patriarchate, but it's what occurred. Now, that being said, St. Flavian II was exiled to Petra by the emperor. He perhaps abdicated. I've seen differing things depending on the historian, and I'll leave that to someone else to get to the nitty-gritty of that. But he leaves. Initially, only 12 bishops recognized Severus, but a 513 synod accepted him. So I'm going to be charitable and say locally, St. Flavian's deposition was accepted, not by the other patriarchs, but locally it was accepted, and Severus' patriarchate was locally accepted, and in some of the patriarchs, not all, not Jerusalem or Rome, accepted Severus' patriarchate. And as I stated, Severus never received patriarchal reception, even after death, by all the patriarchs, which is what's necessary. It was always in dispute. Granted, neither did Meletius fully. Though Rome sort of half recognized them, they recognized both him and Paulinus at the same time in 379. Not a lot of people talk about this, but worth pointing out. But eventually, Meletius' line through St. Flavian was accepted. So we could say eventually there was full patriarchal acceptance even after death for Meletius. We know his patriarchate was legitimate, but that never occurred for Severus. He never met that standard. And we have, what's up, fella Trulodites? And I just want people to know, don't ever name a faction after me. I'm not your leader. I'm not your king. All right. So, but by all means, take those energies and do missionary work and do something productive. I would very much appreciate that. So sounds like a term in geology. It does sound like some sort of metamorphic rock, right? So Justin becomes emperor in 518, and Severus is summoned to Constantinople for a trial. I think it's pretty understandable. Severus like, I'm not going to listen to the emperor anymore. It's nice when he was hurting my enemies, but I'm not going to take my chances with Justin. And it reminds me of the scripture where Jesus says, you live by the sword and you die by the sword. So Severus lived by the sword. That's how he became the patriarch. That's how probably he wasn't killed in Antioch because he had imperial protection. And now he's got to flee because now the sword is against him. So him and 55 other bishops are expelled in the ongoing persecution of Justin. It certainly was some level of persecution because it's mentioned in his letters that flame and sword was to be used against his enemies. But it's worth pointing out that there are 1,200 bishops roundabout in the empire at the time. 55 is a minority, and not all 55 were Severians. 55 is just the total people that were essentially sent to the Roman Empire version of Siberia, which was Egypt. And so there was a persecution this time, but it would be inaccurate to say these were all Severians. So it's a minority, and the Severian portion is a smaller part of that portion. Now, that said, Severus had to struggle with low numbers of committed anti-Chalcedonian clergy. Right? They were not the majority, unlike what the stereotypes tell you. They, even 100 years after Chalcedon, they're not the majority. In his exile, his concern must have been there was little opportunity among the anti-Chalcedonians of the diaspora to have canonically ordained priests or bishops. All right, so Severians, which are the court non-Chalcedonians, we will find they are what the modern Oriental Orthodox were a minority movement in the clergy. And I argue most laity are indifferent. And let's be honest, most laity today are indifferent. I ran into random Egyptians at the local YMCA, and like, we're Orthodox too. We sometimes go to your church. I'm like, oh, that's great. Like, you don't want to argue with people because most people aren't armchair theologians with a YouTube channel. Most people just aren't that invested in this stuff. And so, all right, your bishop today is Oriental Orthodox. They don't even know the bishop changed. He's Chalcedonian. They don't even know the bishop changed. That happens even today. And so most of the laity are indifferent. So I would say most of the laity are normally are Chalcedonian, not because they're committed Chalcedonians, just simply because they're just going with the majority church. Most people go with the flow. And a minority of the movement and the clergy are non-Chalcedonian. So clearly non-Chalcedonianism or committed non-Chalcedonianism is the minority of the church at this latest stage. So that being said, we have Severus was technically never expelled, but abdicated to avoid a synodical trial. And this is kind of important. So as a court non-Chalcedonian, Severus' fortunes waned with imperial protection. And so when Paul of Antioch was consecrated as patriarch, he was accepted by all the patriarchs but not Alexandria. But it shows you that, like other abdications in the past and in the future, it's legitimate that they could replace you. And it doesn't make him an anti-patriarch because there's not two bishops in the city. There was full acceptance of Paul of Antioch's line in 537, 538. So his side is the side that's vindicated, not Severus. Now let's do a summary, because I think for all the disputes people bring up, they're going to have to take one or two sides, and both sides ultimately concede to the point I'm trying to make. The Severian modern Oriental Orthodox line of successors don't originate, by the way, with Severus. They originate with Jacob Baradai. So Severus this is more of almost a historical lesson to learn than something that's actually relevant to the modern dispute. But despite that, as a condescension sensibilities, I will discuss this. Nevertheless, Severus was never a legitimate patriarch if violent mobs and imperial force always invalidate. So if the claim is going to be that there's all this violence at Chalcedon, there's all this violence from Justinian, or what, the stereotypes you hear, which aren't fully accurate, as we've already covered. If we go by the stereotypes, Severus actually lives by those stereotypes. He actually got into power because of violence. And if we're going by that, then he was never legitimately patriarch. So clearly they're not going to accept that. So what's the other choice? If violence and imperial force are secondary, they're bad, but they're not deal breakers. We could still have real consent, like what sadly occurred during the disease that cannot be named. Non-contributing factors, then Severus' abdication and Paul's consecration are allowable, provided the majority of the synod accepted him, like Canon 4, Canon 6 in Nicaea. All right, so going by B, the succession of Paul and then the Chalcedonian line is legitimate, especially considering Severus represented a minority. Now, let's get into the canonical obscurity in Alexandria. Theodosius was the court choice from Theodora, and Gaius, who was the popular choice, were consecrated on the same day. I've seen some sources change chronology, but the most recent source in the question in the Severus, the book about Severus, I think isn't that Haywood? Haywood's book states that they were consecrated on the same day. So Theodosius, was met with a popular uprising because he's the imperial choice. So people are in favor of non-Chalcedonianism because it's opposition to the empire. They don't want to be in favor of the emperor's ban. So there's an uprising against him. And all elements, it's not me saying, I'm quoting this, all elements in Alexandrian society supported him, Gaius. The landowners, merchants, soldiers, the common people. Gaius was exiled. So again, it shows you the emperor is persecuting him, not Theodosius, to Africa and later Sardinia. So Theodosius appealed to imperial law force because the Gainites, who were the Julianists, you could go to the Lion's Den to Subdeacon Daniel Kakish. I have a whole video on Julianism if you want more details, were, to quote the source, the most popular. The source here is Wiki. Not a very good source, right? Were the Julianists, the Gainites, actually more popular than Theodosius. Let me make a more academic case in quoting Wikipedia, though Wikipedia is a good, stereotype of what maybe happened. My opinion is popular means most vocal and violent, right? Like BLM hitting the streets. The majority of the people are probably indifferent, as I said. Majority of people just like, who's my real patriarch? They just go to the closest church. The violent side was the majority. The violent side, rather, the majority violent side was the Gainites, clearly. 3,000 people died to exile during the exile of Gainas. So 3,000 people fought over it. It required 2,000 to 6,000 soldiers to assist Theodosius to take his throne. So again, the whole idea, if you need, like St. Proterus, you need, and of Jerusalem, skipping my mind, but the Patriarch of Jerusalem and Chalcedon, if you need soldiers to help him, somehow they're illegitimate. Well, with Theodosius, that's what he had as well. But yet they accept Theodosius. So 2,000 to 6,000 soldiers assisted Theodosius, and 3,000 did not die defending him when he was deposed and sent to Constantinople. So I will go on a limb and say that even if most people are indifferent, the more popular of the two sides was definitely the Gainites, because the Gainites had 3,000 people willing to die. There were not that many people willing to die for Theodosius. So we actually have like kind of a popular vote where we could say, oh, Wikipedia is actually right. It's worth pointing out, because again, the apologists don't tell you, the Gainites existed for centuries. You can't be like this majority movement of non-Chalcedonianism and then somehow just like disappear overnight, right? They existed for centuries. And John of Nicaea in the 7th century lists them side by side with the Severians. So it implies, so it's not specific enough, it implies they're equal to one another, at least in the 7th century. And Michael the Syrian in the 12th century. So this is like 600 years after the events of Gainas, says they only exist in some places. But the point is, they still exist. 600 years later, there weren't novations 600 years later. The canons still existed, but there were no novations 600 years later. There is no real original Marcionites, no real original Manichees. I mean, they all disappeared. They got replaced with other similar groups. But Gainites still existed. They still existed because they were much more popular than the imperialist court non-Chalcedonians. And so we have this comment. We said, you see a similar thing that appeared between Palamas, initial victor of Barlaam, and the later Palamite councils, where the majority sides of the anti-Palamite factions for a time. And yet sometimes, though I would say, when it settles very quickly in favor of one side, that's a good indication of when the persecution stops, which side people actually agree with. So like with the non-Chalcedonians and the Gainites, you have a good example of when both sides are persecuted, what side people side with, and then it starts evening out. But when non-Chalcedonianism was accepted by the government, most were siding with the Gainites. Now to continue, Theodosius then goes into a sort of voluntary exile. And it's a voluntary exile because he relied upon imperial protection. So if they say, listen, we don't want you here anymore, we'll let you be safe in Constantinople, is that persecution? Or is that saying, listen, we're not going to protect you anymore with all these soldiers if you don't accept us, and they're just going to kill you? Right? You don't hear that very often. That's not so much a persecution against Theodosius, is it? So he did rely upon imperial protection, so it was actually a voluntary exile, though was it a very nice and Christian-like exile? Of course not. Now, Paul of Alexandria, as a Chalcedonian, was elected in his place. Not exactly a great guy. He was deposed in 542 by Antioch, Jerusalem, and the Ecumenical Patriarchate for Origenism and murder. But the fact that they had to then depose him, all the patriarchs, shows that they accepted all the patriarchs accept him as patriarch beforehand. So there was patriarchal acceptance of the replacement for Theodosius. Now let's give a summary for Alexandria. The Severian or modern Oriental Orthodox line of successors doesn't precisely originate with Theodosius. It kind of tangentially does. We'll get into that. But granting this for a moment, okay? Theodosius was either never a legitimate patriarch if we go by violent mob was legitimate and imperial law and order is bad thesis, right? So if he becomes power because imperial law and order smashes a mob and somehow it's bad to have imperial law and order, then he was never patriarch to begin with. We don't accept this. If law and order reflects consent, right? Like most people are law abiding, even in imperial times. So that reflects the consent of the people. And what the majority of the synod accepts is legitimate. Again, even the canons state this. Theodosius was one, legitimate, but two, voluntarily abdicated, was canonically replaced. So going by B, succession of Paul and then the Chalcedonian line is legitimate. Now, only so briefly, let's get into the canonical obscurity in Constantinople. Anthemus was made patriarch in 535 with imperial support, because this is Constantinople after all. Chalcedonian agitation against him gained support of the ecumenical patriarchal synod and Pope of Rome, and they depose Anthemus. A council is held in 536 to accept the deposition, and in the process officially deposes Severus as well, and has pan-patriarchal acceptance by 537 to 538. Now let's get into the parallel church of the non-Chalcedonians and how this started and whether it's canonical. Clearly isn't, but we'll get into the details. To quote Haywood, by 530, after more than a decade of persecution, the anti-Chalcedonian church, particularly in Syria, was suffering from a dearth of clergy that even the energetic Severus and other exiled bishops were incapable or unwilling to make good. When John of Tella in the district of Asarohoni in East Syria began to ordain anti-Chalcedonian clergy, the response was overwhelming. A separatist and independent church was born. So John of Tella begins a parallel church. We have a hello and hello, Enoch. So that being said, not willing to make good. Why didn't Severus, as a court non-Chalcedonian, make more bishops, right? Why was there a dearth of clergy and he wasn't helping fix it? Well, you don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? If you are a court bishop that is housed by the court and patronized by St. Theodora, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. You try to work within the system that exists, even if you're against a lot of things in that system. I would also point out, it's not that Severus was totally self-serving. I would say that Severus would have had some desire. I would actually trust he had every desire to try to help his non-Chalcedonian movement. Because in court non-Chalcedonianism still realistically had a chance of Justinian's full support until 536. I mean, Anthemus was bishop of Constantinople after all. So aren't you, and Severus dies 2 years later, so aren't you going to like bide your time? It looks like you're hearing the rumblings. You even have a bishop of Constantinople. Aren't you going to be patient and go, maybe I can make a comeback? Maybe we don't have to violate the canons because we're going to officially get support soon. That's what they were hoping for. But this is my opinion. I think what changes things are the Gainites in 536. I think Gaius was way bigger, and I think his role in creating the real issue that we have today is neglected by scholarship. Because not coincidentally, Jonatella's on the fringes in 530, right? And Severus is winking at it, right? So he's, without Severus' actual support, so to say, he's appointing all these clergy, but it kind of works in Severus' political favor because it creates a problem, and Severus is the solution to regularize all these people. So it's kind of like collateral, so to say. But then in 536, Gaius creates this parallel hierarchy that's apparently pretty flaming big in Egypt. And I think that's the real issue. So the Jacobite program only begins years later in 557, where Jacob Baradai goes between Constantinople and the Eastern Front, I'll call it, in Syria. Only after this, Theodosius of Egypt, who's in Constantinople by this point, responds in 558 with implicitly court-approved non-Chalcedonian patriarchs resident in Constantinople. So as we can see, this parallel program starts as collateral in negotiations between Severus and Justinian, all right? And it's not with bishops. And then it becomes a response to a lost hope and a political solution. Right, you have the Gainites of this whole parallel hierarchy, and you have it clear that you're just in exile in Constantinople, and you're never going to get another patriarch Constantinople that is non-Chalcedonian. All right, so you have starts as collateral negotiations, then it becomes lost hope, and then it becomes, as we're going to find, an arms race between feuding non-Chalcedonian factions. Another thing that's neglected. Right? If one non-Chalcedonian faction like the Gainites starts getting all these bishops, and then this other Severian side starts getting all these bishops, well, then you're left behind unless you start making bishops. So the whole modern parallel church movement in Oriental Orthodoxy didn't begin like as a carefully thought out plan, but a response to events that cascaded out of control. All right, so now let's continue with Donatello. I want to emphasize he made no episcopal consecrations, and there were no other bishops joining him. Any consecrations outside of his own jurisdiction without synodical approval are uncanonical. Canons are clear in this. Canon 2 of Constable 1 states, the bishops are not to go beyond their diocese to churches lying outside of their bounds, nor bring confusion on the churches, and let not the bishops go beyond their diocese for ordination or any other ecclesiastical ministrations unless they be invited. So we know they're not allowed to, but the question is, are these nullified, or do we need like a synodical judgment against these people for it to be nullified? Or in other words, it's bad to do it, but until you are actually judged guilty, you're not guilty of the crime. What you're going to find is these aren't just bad, they are null and void. They were never good to begin with. The canons are clear on this. Let's continue. Apostolic Canons 34 and 35. Bishops of every nation must acknowledge him who is first among them and account him as their head, and do nothing of consequence without his consent. But each must do those things only which concern his own parish and the country places which belong to it, but neither let him who is the first do anything without the consent of all. And Canon 35, let not a bishop dare to ordain beyond his own limits in cities and places not subject to him. But if he be convicted of doing so without the consent of those persons who have authority over such cities and places, let him be deposed, and those also whom he has ordained. Someone could say, well, that's not null and void. That just means they're judged. Canon 9 of Antioch, which was the jurisdiction, by the way, not only did this have pan-Orthodox acceptance, but this is the jurisdiction, after all, that Donatello is working in. It is proper for the bishops in every province to submit to the bishop who resides in the metropolis, for he must consider the whole province, because businessmen from every corner of the provinces gather in the metropolis. So that's the patriarchy. It is decreed, therefore, that the bishop of the metropolis has top precedence and rank. Other bishops may take no extraordinary action without his consent, as the canon passed down to us at the time of our fathers direct. So it literally cites the apostolic canon. Then may only do such things that involve their own parishes and districts subject to them. Let him undertake nothing further without the bishop of the metropolis, nor the latter without the consent of the others. So we need the patriarch's acceptance for these consecrations to exist, and they did not have that. There wasn't even a patriarch of Antioch after Severus to accept these consecrations. Canon 13 of Antioch. No bishop should presume to travel from one province to another and ordain people to the ministry of the church, not even if he has other clergy with him, without the written permission of the metropolitan bishop and lesser bishop of the country he enters. So meaning you can't go there, like Canon 2 Constable 1 states, and start consecrating people without permission, like Donatello was doing. If without invitation he does meddle in the ordinations and church affairs of provinces that are not under his responsibility, then anything he has done is nullified. Anything he has done is nullified, has no effect. In addition, he himself should be punished properly for this irregularity in a proper undertaking. He should immediately be deposed by the Holy Council. The importance of that is you can't say, well, we need a council to judge these ordinations as invalid, because that canon actually states, no, the ordinations are null and void, and the person doing it must now go to a trial. So it actually differentiates between the two. So those consecrations are null and void. They're not just non-canonical, they are non-existent. Canon 19 of Antioch. Only a council held in the presence of the metropolitan bishop may ordain a bishop. So you need the patriarch. Furthermore, it is best to do this when all the brothers in the ministry of the province gather together with the metropolitan bishop. He should therefore send them all letters of invitation. It is best if all can meet. However, if this is impossible, I mean, like, you can't get everyone in the same room, it is imperative that a majority either be present or take part in the election by letter. So you need a majority, by letter or otherwise. You need a majority. In this way, the decision will be made by the consent of the majority. If anything takes place contrary to these decrees, such action here is hereby nullified. Canon 22 of Antioch. A bishop should not go to a city outside his own jurisdiction to appoint priests or deacons to places outside his control, like Donatello, unless he has the consent of the area's proper bishop. Anything a bishop does without authorization in a province outside his jurisdiction is void. In addition, a council must punish such action. So clearly, holy orders made in violation of the canon are nullified and void. Never existed. The bishop's punishment is not optional. It is a mandatory prescription. But punishment awaits trial and is not automatic like nullification. So before you say, again, this is eisegesis, we have Oriental Orthodox canon law today reiterating the same thing, at least in part. We have this in the Feth and Negest about priest consecrations. If a bishop ordains a priest outside the jurisdiction of his see without the consent of the holder of that see, let him be deposed. If a bishop ordains foreigners, i.e. those outside the jurisdiction, of his own will, meaning doesn't exclude doing so at the consent of the synod, so like you could do it as long as you have the consent of the synod, the holy orders of those whom he ordained shall be null and he shall be deposed. So this idea of null holy orders is in Oriental Orthodox canon law, but in Feth and Negest, only applies to priest consecrations. It's worth pointing out that the canons of Antioch clearly are accepted by the Syriac Orthodox today. So I'm not saying this is anything new, but this idea of null holy orders isn't my invention. It's also in Ethiopian Orthodox canon law. Concerning episcopal elections, it just states, he, the bishop, must have the approval of the people over whom he is appointed and the approval of the patriarch. If someone desires the episcopal office and has the approval of all the people of his city, but not that of the metropolitan of his province, he's not allowed to be bishop without the approval of the metropolitan. If he transgresses this, the council shall excommunicate him and he shall be deposed from the episcopal office. But if the majority of the people support him and he receives the approval of the metropolitan and the patriarch, the choice of the majority shall prevail. All right. So the quote also from that Feth and Negest again, a bishop shall not go into any other place other than which he is appointed, either because his country, diocese, is great or small in size, or because there is a scarcity of inhabitants and gifts. So Ethiopian canon law maintains the same prohibitions as Antiochian canon law, but the emphasis of this one is specifically the one I just read, page 36, on episcopal translations. All right, so we have more evidence that this is not eisegesis. I'm going to quote John of Ephesus, who was the court non-Chalcedonian patriarch of Ephesus. All right, and he wrote the following about the canons. He says, the synodical bishops gathered around him, John, and said to him, what canon law? Oh, wait, I'm thinking of a different John. John Attella here, forgive me. John Attella admits to violating the canons in his hagiography, which is preserved by the non-Chalcedonians. He said the synodical bishops gathered around him, John, and said to him, what canon law allows you to do the thing you are doing? John Attella said to them, when there's a state of confusion such as this, the church does not observe the exactitude of the canons. And so we see an acceptance that, yes, these parallel episcopal, there's a parallel program of consecrations. This parallel program is non-canonical. It's not my opinion. This is admitted in non-Chalcedonian sources that even honor their saints. But his rationale here, the church does not observe the exactitude of the canons. This can apply to disciplines. We are fungible disciplines all the time. Doesn't mean the disciplines change, but in times of emergency, they could be dispensed with, or at least altered in a canonical fashion, but not to nullifications, right? Like you don't have something nullified, but because it is a really tough time, it becomes not void, right? If it's void, it's always void. Otherwise, the latter would require trials, right? If nullifications didn't apply automatically, they would need a trial, but they don't. Canons don't require a trial for nullifications. They require those trials for those that make void holy orders. So that's worth pointing out. Now, Jacob Borodai and and Theodosius, they create what is modern Oriental Orthodoxy today. Now, Theodosius, to quote Haywood, like Severus, was reluctant to jeopardize possible ecclesiastical unity by establishing a rival hierarchy, right? Again, they were hoping for a comeback. In 542, however, when the Arab leader Al-Harith approached Theodora asking for 2 anti-Chalcedonian bishops to be consecrated for the critical border areas with Persia, events took a significant turn. Jacob Bardai was consecrated for Mesopotamia and Syria, and Theodore for Arabia and Palestine. Both bishops began ordaining men to the priesthood and to minor orders. It was only in 557 that they progressed the consecration of bishops. All right, so what we see here is that these men were supposed to be creating priests, not bishops, in areas pretty much outside of Roman jurisdiction with the border with the Persians. And this is important because the border areas lacked bishops or were controlled by Nestorians and schisms. Jacob and Theodore were sent to somewhere effectively outside of Antioch's jurisdiction. So these were, though I would say not very charitably to the Assyrians, not considered parallel episcopacies by Theodora. And so canonically, who has jurisdiction over these areas? Let's read Canon 2 of Constantinople 1. But the churches of God in heathen nations must be governed according to the custom which has prevailed from the time of the fathers. It doesn't say the custom. The custom is you could evangelize it. It's like a no man's land. It's what America is today, why we have 15 jurisdictions. You could pretty much go no man's land on somewhere that is a nation that doesn't have a singular jurisdiction. So if the consecration of Jacob Bardai is canonical, the preceding, I would say, is okay, considering Theodosius is still a bishop. You could still make other bishops for places that are heathen lands, and that's what he did. But when Jacob went outside his diocese and started appointing Oriental Orthodox bishops, or not Chalcedonian bishops, he committed jurisdictional canonical violations. And this is effectively papalist direct jurisdiction before the papacy. It's the papal heresy, because he's assuming direct jurisdiction over somewhere that's not his jurisdiction. And so the origin of the episcopacy of Oriental Orthodoxy is with the papalist ecclesiological heresy. They didn't invent it, though. Novatianists did this. Donatists did this. But now the non-Chalcedonians did this. These are sort of not the shoulders of giants you want to be standing on, but it is a fact. Now, I'm going to quote a hagiography from Oriental Orthodox resource to show it's not me making this up and not me exaggerating with the papal stuff. Let me read it. At the request of the Arab king Al-Harith ibn Jabala al-Ghassani and Empress Theodora's efforts, he, Jacob Bardai, was ordained a universal bishop in 543-544 by More Theodosius, Patriarch of Alexandria, and who was exiled at the time in Constantinople. 3 imprisoned bishops participated with Patriarch Athanasius, it must mean Theodosius to say, typo, in laying hands. More Jacob, the universal bishop, was set out on his mission touring Syria, Egypt, Armenia, Cappadocia, Sicilia, Assyria, Pamphylia, Laconia, yada, 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 in Persia, right? But you see it right there. Ordain a universal bishop. Who else assumes universal jurisdiction? The Pope. So implicit in the origin of their episcopacy is the acceptance of universal jurisdiction. And without that, they don't have a church movement. And that's very concerning. Very concerning. We have some Oriental Orthodox or Papists too. Ecclesiologically, yes, in their origins. I don't want to exaggerate, but that's in the origins they are. Now, starting 557, we start getting this arms race between Theodosius and Jacob Bardai. So according to not Haywood, but Allen, in opposition to Theodosius, Jacob Bardai starts appointing bishops. And so Theodosius responds then by appointing his own bishops, and he tries to put together a rival pentarchy against the imperial church. I guess the idea would be, I have a bigger movement than Jacob Bardai has. So how does he start this? He consecrates, Oh, wait, yeah, no, I'm getting a little confused. Jacob Bardai makes a fake patriarch of Antioch, Sergius of Tella, who's a tritheist heretic. And so this creates a fake successor to Severus, which could then fake canonically accept all these other consecrations within the jurisdiction, because otherwise, like in the Antiochian canon, you need the metropolitan, which is a euphemism for the patriarch. They don't have that, so now you got to make a fake one who only lives in Constantinople to rubber stamp it. All right, because again, it's a royalist court movement in non-Chalcedonians. He never left Constantinople. So the response by, as I was saying, by Theodosius is to start making his own rival pentarchy. He does this by making John of Ephesus a fake bishop, a fake bishop of Ephesus to resurrect the defunct Ephesian patriarchate, and so that's to replace Constantinople. He also appoints a patriarch of Cyprus, because Cyprus is like a rival in the Antiochian jurisdiction. So that being said, it's a contra or against the ecumenical patriarch. It's a fake patriarch. He's resident in Constantinople. He never leaves. We've seen his own writings that he's in Constantinople. And ironically, his slur against the Chalcedonians is to call them Synodites, meaning he recognizes they have working synods that are canonical, and that's the name he calls them. Because even he admits, by his name calling, that the Chalcedonian side has canonical synods, while we see the non-Chalcedonians are creating out of nothing, really flim-flam fugazi synods, to use the term from Donnie Brasco. Now, that being said, 564, Theodosius consecrated Paul the Black as the Patriarch of Antioch. And so this is try to assume more power over what was Jacob Bardai's jurisdiction. And when Theodosius dies, Paul is the only Oriental Orthodox patriarch with any sort of legitimacy, right? Other than, I would say, like guys like John of Ephesus. Now, clearly he's not properly consecrated according to patriarchal reception, right? Like the other patriarchs don't accept him. Canon 6 of Nicaea 1 is not followed. The majority of the synod and the bishops don't accept him. There's no local acceptance. The guy lives in Constantinople. So we could see here Theodosius, as the only legitimate claim he can make is as Bishop of Alexandria, but he accepts his deposition by going into exile. So he's just a bishop without a jurisdiction. Now is assuming to himself direct jurisdiction by now appointing a bishop in Antioch, which he was never a bishop in the Antiochian jurisdiction. He has no basis for doing this. But again, this shows you the canonical shenanigans, or the non-canonical shenanigans, really, of the origin of the episcopacy of Oriental Orthodoxy. It's not me trying to be mean. These are the historical facts at hand. Now, very clearly in the canons, parallel jurisdiction is uncanonical. Let me quote Canon 8 of Nicaea. But if they come over where there's a bishop or presbyter of the Catholic Church, it is manifest that the bishop of the church must have the bishop's dignity, and he who was named bishop by those who are called Cathari shall have the rank of presbyter unless it shall seem fit to the bishop to admit him to partake in the honor of the title. Or if this should not be satisfactory, then shall the bishop provide for him a place as chorepiscopus or presbyter in order that he may evidently be seen to be of the clergy, and that there may not be two bishops in the city. Repeat, there may not be two bishops in the city. All right. So the non-Chalcedonians recognized the Synodites as bishops. That's why they even called them Synodites. They knew they were bishops. I might get into detail later, but even John of Ephesus will detail like their apostolic succession and their elections, because he recognizes that they are bishops. But they knowingly still made a parallel line. They knowingly still made a second bishop in the city, which they know canonically they can't do. And so we have a crucial non-Chalcedonian source asserting the invalidity of uncanonical parallel episcopacy. So this is not just my opinion. As I was referring to before, John of Ephesus admits this, right? So this is one of their patriarchs of Ephesus admitting this. He says, nevertheless, they prevailed on Peter of Alexandria in their savage violence audaciously to pronounce sentence of deposition against him, Theodore of Alexandria. So he's talking about this disputed non-Chalcedonian versus non-Chalcedonian election of a patriarch, in violation of all canonical order, by which, in fact, his own consecration, Paul of Alexandria, was illegal and invalid. Invalid, inasmuch as he was the second appointed to fill a throne already occupied, a thing which the rules and the canons of the church forbid. So again, not my opinion. I'm quoting, in fact, the most important non-Chalcedonian historical source of the 6th century right here. It's John of Ephesus. He is the most important source of the error. And that's how he interprets the canons, the plain reading the canons that I gave you. But he's pointed it against the non-Chalcedonian side he disagrees with. He's not pointed against himself. Now, it's worth pointing out, to this day, the Oriental Orthodox reject parallel episcopacies. The Fethanages does. Says very plainly, 2 bishops shall not be appointed over 1 city. And the rank of patriarch may not be held by 2 persons simultaneously in 1 see, and if 2 are elected in 1 city, the appointment of the one who was elected first shall be ratified. Right? So the one elected first is the canonical patriarch in Ethiopian Orthodox canon law, but there already was a Chalcedonian patriarch. So they're violating their own canon law. Now, the interesting thing here is simultaneous election requires a re-election. And to rewind, and you can get more detail if you rewind the video, but this would invalidate Gaius and Theodosius, who were consecrated on the same day. There was no re-election until a Chalcedonian was elected in 537. Right? So this shows you their own canons would invalidate, because remember, this was the Coptic Nomo canon before it became Ethiopian canon law, say the same thing, and in fact create extreme canonical difficulties for even the bishops that are more legitimate for them. So this is interesting, to say the least. Now, for what it's worth, John of Ephesus isn't so pig-headed to admit that, like, these sort of flim-flam, imposed royalist non-Chalcedonian patriarchs are great, because he admits that not having local approval for their election is unjust. And so even though he says that the other side that he disagreed with in Alexandria was wrong, he admits that it was kind of unjust what they did to them. Right? They were invalid, but it was still wrong what we did to them. He writes, Theodore, by birth as Syrian, was asked to consent to be made Pope of Alexandria. Paul of Antioch was physically present and subsequently gave it his approbation and received him and communicated with him. And as was said, they even addressed a synodical letter to one another as patriarchs respectively of Antioch and Alexandria. So, this is not the part that talks about it being unjust. We'll have to keep reading, but I'll just point out here that when they made these patriarchs, these fake patriarchs, they went and then wrote like fake systatic letters to one another, or consecration letters. So they're trying to really fulfill the role of patriarch despite like an election of 2 people, and then claiming it was legitimate. And this is where no local approval is unjust. So we could see that John of Ephesus writes, and when now all imagine that in accordance with the canons, they performed a great work for the union and establishment of the Church of Syria and Alexandria, because the bishop was made without the knowledge of the Alexandrians, I think you need that, a thing which justice forbade, it proved the ruin of them all, and of the whole Church of the East and of the Egyptians. All right, so we have that quote there. Now, let's talk about Alexandria's non-Chalcedonian episcopal crisis. Why, right? Why did they go make this parallel episcopate? In 542, he, Theodosius of Alexandria, consecrated the redoubtable Jacob Bardai, who reconstituted the monophysite party in Syria and gave it some help in Egypt as well. Theodosius administered his patriarchate to some extent, but perhaps by agreement, did not consecrate bishops for Egypt. From Justinian's point of view, he was safer in Constantinople than leading the opposition at home. Egypt's non-Chalcedonian bishops all predated 536. So this is something important to point out. We're getting new bishops by the late 550s, 560s, in Egypt in the 570s and 580s. But all the canonical ones were in 536. that were non-Chalcedonian. So clearly by the 570s, they were aging out. They were getting too old and dying. So to continue the article, the death of its prelates disorganized the Egyptian church, although the ministrations of Jacob Baradai and wandering Syrians saved its priesthood. So he credits, based on John of Ephesus, that Syrian bishops came in, and invalid bishops, by the way, because all the bishops Jacob Baradai made were null and void for the canonical reasons we stated, were what resurrected the non-Chalcedonian church in Egypt. Let's read John of Ephesus, the primary source. Only one bishop, a certain John, could be found, that is in Egypt, to consecrate him. That's the Patriarch of Alexandria. And even he was himself waiting his trial for some offense. So like John was, he had trouble, but at least he was a bishop. And when they knew not what to do next, two foreign bishops, right, in violation of the canons, arrived, who had lately been consecrated. So they're new bishops for the Church of Syria by the blessed Jacob. All right, so that's what the primary source states. Now let's talk about Severian consolidation for Islam, right? So how did the Severians take over the Gainites? Let's get into the details, because I think that helps show how did the Oriental Orthodox Church crystallize and become what it is today. Let's give a review of the different non-Chalcedonians in 581. This is important because people just think non-Chalcedonians since Dioscorus are Severians, but that's highly artificial. Dioscorus had nothing to do with Severus. He obviously lived before him. There were people when Severus was fighting with Julian, were fighting over Dioscorus' memory, and after the Gainites, there's all sorts of divisions among the non-Chalcedonians. In fact, I count 6 serious parties with parallel episcopacies. One, the Gainites, which are Egyptian Julianists. They were the most popular for the reasons I already discussed. 2, the Paulites, Syrian Severians under Paul of Antioch, right? And under them were Theodorites, which was their chosen Alexandrian patriarch. I don't think there were a lot of Theodorites, to be honest, but I believe most of the Antiochian Synod would have been Paulites after Jacob Baradai died. Then there were Peterites, which were the Alexandrian Severians against Theodore of Alexandria. You start tripping because all the names are the same. Then there are the Jacobites, which obviously under Jacob Baradai, but then he's dead in 581. So sort of like his spiritual successors. Syrian Severians with Jacob before death. Now the Peterites ordained Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, who later broke communion to absorb the Paulites. And that's how the Paulites and the Jacobites then consolidate into a singular group. We must not forget the Canonites, which were tritheist with bishops in Constantinople, Greece, and Rome, and the Athanasians, which were tritheist with the same parallel episcopacies. So we got 6 feuding parties that aren't minor, being that they're throughout the world. So how do we get just Oriental Orthodox today? Let's talk about their origin of their episcopacies. Right, I'll make this bigger. The Gainites were canonical bishops who were Julianist, who made a new uncanonical parallel synod. They, over time, as I discussed, died out and their faith were absorbed by other anti-imperial churches. Then we have the Paulites. They were originated by Theodosius of Alexandria and the Jacobites in Syria. As we already discussed, we have the Peterites with one canonical bishop and 2 Jacobites of recent vintage. And then we have the Jacobites originate with Jacob Baradai. Now, why are the Peterites and Jacobites red? Because they are the groups that are modern Oriental Orthodox, right? The rest aren't. So that's why I point this out when people say the majority were Oriental Orthodox. Or it's like, well, the majority aren't the same Oriental Orthodox or these groups. They were a minority of a larger ocean of non-Chalcedonians. We have the Theodorites, one a canonical Egyptian, Longinus, consecrated by new Jacobites for a mission, perhaps. This is not the video for Longinus, but just worth pointing out. And 2 new Jacobites. Then we have Conanites, Conan leaving the canonical church, and Athanasians, the same with Athanasius, not obviously Athanasius of Alexandria. All right, so we have all different groups. The Conanites started with a bishop that's canonical. Athanasians did, but everyone else doesn't really we have non-canonical bishops other than a few here or there. We have people with void holy orders. Not my word, canonically void holy orders. All right. And so we'll make that bigger. Now, the Syrians or Theodosians pick Theodore. Let's talk about this. Now, Longinus, Theodosius made him bishop of Nubia. John of Chalcis and George Urtia consecrated Theodore of Rhamnus, archimandrite of monastery in Scetis, as Pope of Alexandria with Paul of Antioch's support. Now, to quote John of Ephesus, we have this. And this, in fact, happened to the wise clergy of Alexandria, for they were by no means men of inferior merit or without knowledge, had not the gall of anger agitated them, and wrath made them stumble in their Peterites' hasty and uncanonical proceeding. So, right, the Peterites in opposition to Theodore. When the synodal letter reached them informing them that a bishop had been consecrated for them by those who were Orthodox, again, non-Chalcedonian, like themselves, and members of their communion, because owing to the urgency of the times, it was done without their vote. Right? So they're arguing we had to essentially violate the canons to make this canonical bishop, which is really not that compelling, clearly. Now, some Egyptians then consecrate Peter. They took so violent a course as to seize upon and consecrate Peter as the second bishop. At the same time, really third bishop, because it's a Chalcedonian bishop, at the same time upon the same throne. Whether this was right, anyone may judge who considers that during the whole space of 10 years, which had elapsed since the death of the blessed Theodosius, they might have created, for themselves a bishop without dispute, whereas they waited until the news reached them of the appointment of Theodore, and then made an election in anger to be a cause of quarrel and dissension and schism in the church. For Peter, whom they elected, was immediately regarded by many as an adulterer, meaning like, second bishop is schismatic. And moreover, to quote John of Ephesus, to strengthen his position, they persuaded this second prelate, Peter, thrust, contrary to church laws, a canonical order into another's throne, to consecrate no less, as was said, than 70 bishops. Though were a man, but seeking for labors to till his fields, you would find it no easy matter to bring together at one time so many men fit for his purpose. So I want to make this clear. The Egyptian Synod that the Coptic Orthodox have today was reconstituted with 70 new bishops uncanonically from an uncanonically appointed bishop. All right. So we have their whole church originates with void bishops, canonically speaking. God knows. I'm not going to judge the actual charism of an individual. I'm just saying what the canons say and what other non-Chalcedonians admit the canons say and what modern non-Chalcedonian canon law says the canons say. All right. The Egyptian Synod was reconstituted, right? They didn't make 70 people bishop for no reason. This implied very few, if any, like one or two remaining non-Chalcedonian bishops before the election. This was an arms race between the Jacobites versus, was this an arms race, the Jacobites versus response to Chalcedonians? I want to pose this to you guys. Everyone thinks like they had to do this because the Chalcedonians are meanies, but I think you're starting to see now following this video, the real impetus behind this was internecine violence among non-Chalcedonians in Egypt. It had nothing to do with the Chalcedonians. It was a fight between non-Chalcedonians. So they didn't do this because of persecution per se. The main motivator was a episcopal arms race so that they could have a say over the future of the non-Chalcedonian movement. So I find this very interesting. It was like kind of a breaking apart of the imperial court party of the non-Chalcedonians. They had no chance of making it back in Constantinople, maybe a John of Ephesus there, but they felt like they had no chance. And it starts falling apart at the seams, kind of like when everyone starts going crazy like Titanic when it's sinking. And this is what we see here. Now, to continue, the court non-Chalcedonians love the canons. They'll cite them when it suits them. So like John of Ephesus and other Theodosian consecratees, vis-a-vis like the Jacobites, consider themselves the canonical non-Chalcedonian group. So they considered the Peterites uncanonical for having elected their patriarch apart from their fake patriarch of Antioch, Peter the Black. But in reality, the locality elects the patriarch and other patriarchs ratify, as we already covered. So really, it's like it's an argument between two invalid people, but one invalid person is a little more legitimate in some respects than the other invalid person. But to the person that's valid, you're sort of like, what's going on here? So I could quote Stephen of Cyprus, that other autocephalous non-Chalcedonian church, a bishop canonically consecrated by the Orthodox command of Theodosius. He invokes the canons. He's also a Theodosian. We could see in John Ephesus' history in book 1, he recognized the canonicity of the Chalcedonian synods. And overall, this shows a lack of introspection as to their own canonicity, that they're saying, you're not canonical, you're not canonical. They would affirm the canons when polemically useful, but not like, look, oh, this doesn't look good for us. But this happens every day. The courtesan, for example, looks down upon the streetwalker. The courtesan's more legitimate than the streetwalker, but to an actual legitimate wife, the courtesan is just as much as a you-know-what as the streetwalker is. But the fact that that happens today shouldn't surprise us. People act like this in the past. Now, let's talk about how non-Chalcedonianism crystallized and became a majority movement. And it was due to favoritism under Islam. It starts under the Persians, but then crystallizes due to favoritism under Islam. And let's begin with the Persians favoring the non-Chalcedonians. Now, if you're not aware, the Persians invaded the eastern part of the Eastern Roman Empire and devastated all the churches, but for obvious political reasons, hurt the Chalcedonians the most, right? They're the official people. The churches are officially theirs. So clearly people ransacking the official people is really hurting them directly. Now, to quote a Coptic source, some Copts felt relief because alien patriarchs were no longer appointed by Byzantium to oppress their Egyptian church. All right, so now like there's some relief that the official church isn't there anymore, at least among the sectarians. Like I said, the average person probably just wants to go to church and is afraid of the Persians, probably doesn't feel too invested, just like the modern Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian today in the official division. Now, the policy among Syrians, so outside of Egypt, was also similar. They had some level of official toleration. They even had a reunion synod with state allowance, which didn't occur under the Byzantines. So this shows some official recognition among the Persians, while they could even have elections for a bishop at Antioch among the Chalcedonians during this time. So there is an active persecution against the Chalcedonians, while there is some state protection afforded to the non-Chalcedonians under the Persians, just historical fact. To continue, according to Dionysius of Telmar, who's a non-Chalcedonian patriarch of Antioch, he wrote, when Khosroes, that's the Persian emperor, conquered Mesopotamia and expelled the Romans from it, he ordered at the same time the Chalcedonian bishops to be expelled from their churches and those churches to be given to the Jacobites. So we have from a non-Chalcedonian source him admitting these were Chalcedonian bishops in Chalcedonian churches. They were the ones kicked out, and then Jacobites are put in their place. This is not my opinion. This is the opinion of a non-Chalcedonian source, of their patriarch of Antioch. All right? And that's what I want to point out. Appointed versus expelled. All right? So people say, oh, the Chalcedonians appointed bishops that were foreign or whatever. I'm not going to say that's great. You know, people went along with it ultimately. People go along with a lot of bad things. Not great. But here, if that's a persecution, what's expelling people and forcefully putting other people in their place? Well, that's clearly more persecution-y. One's a true persecution. The other is just state strong-arming, I'd say. Clearly, the non-Chalcedonians start having ascendancy due to persecution from the Persians against the Chalcedonians. That's fact, and that's admitted by a non-Chalcedonian source. Now, Islam likewise establishes non-Chalcedonianism as the official Christianity. How do they do this? Because it's not like they wrote a law. I mean, some scholars, you kind of wonder, like they're looking for, like, they never wrote an official law that said non-Chalcedonian is official. They never wrote official law that the non-Chalcedonian laity are to be treated better than Chalcedonian laity. No, that's not how it works. How did it work? Let's talk about it. We know, of course, Heraclius, the Eastern Roman Emperor, reconquered his empire from the Persians, only to pretty much immediately lose it to the Muslims. The Muslim Caliphate lasted for many years, and for over 130 years officially recognized the non-Chalcedonians as the official church of Christians within their empire and gave them rights over church buildings, And they didn't allow Chalcedonians to locally elect patriarchs and minister their temples until the 700s, right? So kind of like what the Persians did, which we just read from Dionysius Tel-Tamar, or however you pronounce his name. Now, the consolidation of Christians under non-Chalcedonians understandably commences, right? It's 130 years. It's more than anyone's lifetime. And you're having your local church is always a non-Chalcedonian. There's a certain point, like, if you had certain imperial sympathies or like, oh, I'm not the schismatics, your children's 130 years later, it'd be pretty far removed from that to feel very invested in it. And so consolidation just organically commences due to that. But let me give some easy proof for people that aren't going to do all the super digging that Islam favored the non-Chalcedonians. Here we have on Wikipedia, but you'll find it on the patriarchal websites when they give their succession list, what their succession was during the time of the Caliphate's ascendancy. We see here in Wiki, Muslim conquest caused the Chalcedonian See of Alexandria to become vacant. Chalcedonian patriarchs of Alexandria after the Islamic conquest. After 727, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III once more attempted to install a Melkite patriarch in Alexandria with the consent of the Muslim authorities. A bishopric was, from that moment onwards, again headed by a patriarch. So there's no patriarchs at all for like 80 years in Alexandria, other than perhaps those living in Constantinople. There's no patriarchs at all. And as we could see, Theodore, Peter V, Peter VI, like, we don't have years next to them because we don't even know where they were exactly. They're probably in Constantinople and we're in Alexandria. So clearly that's proof of persecution. Here's Antioch, Athanasius, vacant for 30 years to the Persians, right? Not vacant for the Antiochian Syriac Orthodox, but vacant for the Chalcedonians. Then we have Macedonius. Then we don't know who, as we could see. It's a big question mark and big years missing in the middle because, again, that persecution. But how about the non-Chalcedonians? And I'm going to make this really big. All right, we got very exact years and consecutive, one after the other, one after the other. They exist during the Persians. They exist during the Muslims. Same for the Egyptians. Same for the Arabs in Syria. So easy proof that the non-Chalcedonian side was given preferential treatment from the Muslims. It's not my opinion. It's pretty blatant. Now let's address, did the non-Chalcedonians help the Muslims? Short answer is no. The longer answer is it's more complicated. They did not help defend against the Muslim onslaught, is the main thing. To quote Costoliniac, during the Muslim conquest, remembering the Byzantine persecution, the Copts did not engage on the side of the Greeks. Perhaps this was the will of the monophysical hierarchy of Egypt. Ibn Abd al-Hakam states in his The Conquest of Egypt in North Africa and Andalusia that the Coptic bishop of Alexandria encouraged the Egyptian Christians to be passive towards the Arab conquest of Egypt. Now, I know what people are going to say. They're going to say that we can't trust the Muslim source, but I want you to consider something because we got to work with the sources we have. This is a positive estimation by a Muslim writer. He's not trying to libel the non-Chalcedonians. He's actually trying to say, look how good they are because they didn't fight against us. So this implies a favorable presentation of history, not some sort of slander. Now, we have this in an article on an Oriental Orthodox website, Caliphate favoring the non-Chalcedonians. Pope Benjamin I, the non-Chalcedonian patriarch, that's Severian, was still in hiding and had to be recalled by Amr, a caliphate-like ruler, who promised him safety and fearlessness. Impressed with his dignity as a man of God, Amr authorized him to freely administer the affairs of his church and people. Freely administer. Did the Chalcedonians get to freely administer? Although Christians were now counted as dhimis, subject but protected people, they had to pay taxes. It's a kind of persecution by the Muslims. By comparison with the last years of Byzantine rule, this was a time of peace and safety. To further information about the Caliphate favoring the non-Chalcedonians, the Melkite Patriarchate of Alexandria became extremely weak after the conquest when the Copts took over many of the Melkite churches. Right, just like the Persians did, the in the Antiochian jurisdiction, what happened to the Syriac Orthodox and the Antiochian Orthodox. The relationship between the Melkites and the Syrian Egyptian monophysites was difficult because the Arabs favored the churches which were not linked with Byzantium. Again, the Arabs favored the churches which were not linked with Byzantium. I don't think this is a biased scholarly take here based on what we've learned so far. We know that Amir Umar ibn Sa'd al-Ansari allowed for safety and public defense of the Christian faith from John III of Antioch, as preserved in a primary source is disputation of John and the Emir. And Michael the Syrian wrote with satisfaction that the memory of Chalcedon was erased from the Euphrates to the east. So we have a non-Chalcedonian source writing that, yeah, we're happy that Chalcedon was being pretty much persecuted against by the Caliphate. So that's their own sources saying this. So having already discussed how the Egyptian and Syriac Orthodox churches have invalid holy orders, we never covered the Armenians, but the Armenians are a national schism. They would have not originated with people ordaining outside of their jurisdiction. So they would at least have, there'd be the schismatics with holy orders. How about the Ethiopians? Do they have holy orders? Do they have a canonical synod? Let's get into the nitty gritty. Was there collateral damage in Ethiopia from the non-canonical programs in Egypt? Well, in a map in Friend's the Monophysite controversy, you could see Makura in southern Egypt was Chalcedonian 700, Alwan, Sudan was Chalcedonian 580. So we have some reason to believe that even if there were a lot of not Chalcedonians kicking around, there would have been also Chalcedonians kicking around that could have been sending clergy to Ethiopia. There are in a pro-Oriental Orthodox book scholarly takes that Monroe Hay doesn't agree with, but so you're aware what other scholars believe about the origin and the canonical integrity of the Ethiopian church. Those scholars write, Ethiopians honored non-miaphysites prelates as saints, and that the Aschamite King Caleb was obedient to the Catholic patriarch set up by Justin Alexandria. Ethiopia apparently only would have of necessity adopted monophysitism, i.e. that's taking sides of the Oscars in his mind, after the establishment of the Muslim empire had cut off the Melkite succession. So his argument is that until Islam came invaded, they were Chalcedonians, at least, officially in Ethiopia. That's one scholarly take. Here's another, and I'll make this a little bigger. Monophysitism is attributed to the Ethiopian church primarily on the basis of its relationship with the Coptic church. Ethiopian contact with the monophysite Coptic church remained minimal until 1270. The status of monastic Coptic abunas presiding over the Ethiopian church was never fully regularized for the time of Takel-Haymanot in 1270. Takel-Haymanot may be said to be the first Ethiopian to be converted to Coptic monophysitism, and thus became the main mediator of the Coptic alliance to the Ethiopian church. Ironically, in his time, Takel-Haymanot functioned as an abuna, or meaning the patriarch of the Ethiopians, the last such indigenous prelate we hear of, which fact gives still more support to the belief that preceding him, there indeed must have been native Ethiopian abunas. So my point in bringing this up is we sort of anachronistically think because into the 1960s, Egypt was sending the bishops to be metropolitan in Ethiopia, that the Ethiopians always had an Egyptian metropolitan. But in fact, we have historical evidence that this did not occur until 1270. And if this did not occur to 1270, they would have had a native synod until 1270. And if they had a native synod until 1270, they would have had bishops that originated before, arguably, the Chalcedonian, non-Chalcedonian split, because they're evangelized since the 4th century. In that event, then they should have a canonical synod, even if there's some infusions of non-canonical bishops from the non-Chalcedonians. All right, so we'll continue with this 1400s Muslim scholar, take with a grain of salt, because Al-Kashandi is very far after the fact, but he concurs with the sort of analysis given. He said, the churches of the Melkites were taken over by the Jacobites. Right, taken over by the Jacobites. A patriarch was later appointed for the Melkites after they had been without a patriarch for 100 years. The supreme patriarchal power remained in the hands of the Jacobites. It was they who sent bishops to the districts, and since that time, the Nubians and those of Habasha and who lived beyond them became Jacobites. So this Muslim historian pretty much says that it was due to Islam that then the Ethiopians stopped having a patriarch, and due to that, then they became Jacobite. So that's another historical take. Now, what's my take on Ethiopia? I don't think it's very credible that Ethiopia didn't have a significant majority of native Ethiopian bishops in their synod. Ongoing evangelization, dare I say, more than they care to admit, because they like to say they were all Jews since like 1000 BC, and they all pretty much instantly became Christian, but they were evangelized over many centuries. You know, they grew more and more Christian over time. So this ongoing evangelization explains the reception of foreign clergy. They didn't have a ton of their own, without major discernment of their non-Chalcedonian, Chalcedonian, origin. So, right. So I'm of the opinion they would have accepted a non-Chalcedonian if it suited at the moment, and they would have accepted a Chalcedonian if it suited them at the moment. The 4th century conversion of Ethiopia was generally of royalty in the upper class, not a mass conversion. And that's why there would have been ongoing evangelization. For example, the 9 saints, which people say they're non-Chalcedonian saints, and their evangelism in Ethiopia in the 5th century is not proof of ecclesiastical non-Chalcedonianism, right? We're talking about the integrity of the synod, not whether or not they became philosophically in adherence with non-Chalcedonianism. Because there was no parallel non-Chalcedonian church at that point, right? So that's kind of a relevant point that's brought up a lot. It really makes no difference for our purposes here. Now, in the 6th century, under King Caleb, the Ethiopian Christians were in connection with a non-Chalcedonian but Melkite patriarch, Timothy III. Right? John of Ephesus does not mention a Syriac or Egyptian non-Chalcedonian connection up to the 580s. But he notes receiving clergy under Justinian during Timothy III. So we have no reason to believe there had been an infusion of void clergy from the Jacobites based on the primary and contemporary sources we have. Wouldn't he, argument for silence, but wouldn't he have noted a Longinus-like mission to Ethiopia? Caleb had a Chalcedonian bishop in Arabia, all right? So we know this. So there's no reason why there couldn't be both Chalcedonian, non-Chalcedonian, and specifically canonical bishops being sent to Ethiopia. I don't think it's very convincing Caleb was a scrupulous non-Chalcedonian. He would have just taken whatever bishops his allies gave him. So to continue, allegedly after Theodosius was deposed, Abraham, who's the king after Caleb, would not take clergy from Chalcedonians, but our earliest evidence of this is a non-Ethiopian 9th century non-Chalcedonian source. So take that for what it's worth. Same source says that the entire native Ethiopian synod died out. So like this actually, if that were to be true, would permit the possibility that they would have took Jacobite infusions because they had no native synod. There's indications that the Gainites tried to enter Ethiopia, but that they were kicked out. So we don't have reason to believe that Gainites would have been part of the clergy in Ethiopia. And we have an Arabic history that indicates, similar to Longinus, Theodorites had a Jacobite bishop to Ethiopia, but Monroe admits that this is potentially anachronistic and geographically confused. He's thinking of the Longinus mission to Sudan, and he's confusing that with Ethiopia, which is my opinion, by the way. Now, that said, from the 6th century, there's very little information available about either the history of the Ascomite kingdom or its ecclesiastical affairs. Their kingdom collapsed during this era. We lack information of the crucial parallel church era. So, like, that's why we're going to sources centuries later. We don't have enough primary sources. We just have argument from silence from John of Ephesus, which is not very strong. We have scanty non-Chalcedonian historical sources indicating a dying out like Egypt and the installation of Jacobites. I would just say why I don't believe it is how, without Justinian in Ethiopia, could they make a dying out? Like, there's no impetus for it. Okay, the king collapsed. That doesn't mean like people stopped being Christian instantly in Ethiopia. It might have hurt Christianity in Ethiopia, but there still would have been bishops and Christians. So that part just doesn't make sense. I don't think it's realistic that bishop had no resident native bishops. That's my view. I think they had native bishops. They always had a canonical synod. Indeed, there are notable gaps in episcopal succession, but a scholarship admits, is this proof of scanty documentation or a lack of bishops? We don't know. probably scanty documentation. There's still so much that's not translated yet in Ge'ez. And perhaps it's because they still needed to evangelize Ethiopia more is another possibility. So my view again on Ethiopia. Ethiopian Synod was always chaotic, but it had bishops. It's more chaotic than they dare admit, but it had bishops. By the 7th century, the Ethiopian Synod likely had both Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians based upon both Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians at the periphery of Ethiopia. I mean, we have no written sources, so what else do we base this upon? There's no state apparatus to impose matters one way or the other, so we have no reason to believe in a native dying out. I just think that's the wrong geography being opposed by a 9th century history. We do know that Muslims in Egypt played a role in the non-Chalcedonian rise within Ethiopia, and this shows geopolitics. It's a way of trying to get control at the caliphate periphery. We know, for example, that Severus of Ashomin, a Copt in the 10th century, claimed that Amr sent Benjamin, that 7th century Severian non-Chalcedonian patriarch, to negotiate with Ethiopia. So we know that they're getting some official favor where their official church diplomat is that particular non-Chalcedonian patriarch, not a Gainite, not a Chalcedonian. This implies Muslim recognition of Severians, right? Because it's being used for official state business, not Gainites or Chalcedonians. And we have, hope everyone's having a blessed Lent. Thank you so much. And we have this. It sounds unrealistic to believe an entire native church died out, especially one truly believes in the promise of Christ that he would not permit his church to be prevailed by the gates of hell. So we'll continue. Amir read Isaac the First, and Amir, a different one, read Isaac the First. Isaac the First was a late 7th century Severian patriarch, diplomatic letter, and sided with Isaac against Melkites to send bishops to Ethiopia and the Nubians. So this implies that the Chalcedonians were trying to send bishops, even when they were cut off from Constantinople. It's not they stopped trying to fulfill the gospel admonishment of Christ to make disciples of every nation. And this implies that they had already sent clergy. It's like, what, is this the first time they ever sent clergy to Ethiopia in the late 7th century? And if they were, for whatever reason, unsuccessful in the 7th century, surely they had to do it in the 6th century if they're trying to do it in the late 7th century, under persecution, that is. We have that the Coptic Patriarch John XI, the 1400s, promised to appoint Metropolitan Ethiopia with the Sultan's permission. So this is consistent history of Muslim meddling through the Coptic Oriental Orthodox Church as a way to get them to somehow have some power over Ethiopia. So it's a sort of program encouraged. I'm not going to say it's like orchestrated entirely. I mean, the Coptic Orthodox had every reason to want to do this too, but it's certainly supported by the Caliphate. So in short, to answer the question, Ethiopian Synod is a mixed bag canonically, right? That's my opinion, but I would say, charitably speaking, it's canonical enough because they, even with infusions of void bishops, they would have had native bishops and other Chalcedonian bishops infused that would have been canonical in origin. Now, let's talk about the demographics of non-Chalcedonian schisms, because this is something that I'm going to issue my opinion. It's not the majority scholarly opinion, but it's something that I think needs to be taken seriously considering the evidence. So the stereotype is the Chalcedonians were the official church with few local adherents, and the majority were like the vanguard non-Chalcedonians. Now, scholarship says the Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians were about 50-50 in Syria, and to quote, 90% non-Chalcedonian in Egypt. Now, I want to point out this is misleading, as non-Chalcedonians were divided between 4 factions, right? So it's not like you have 90% are Severians. That's not what the evidence shows. Now, my opinion, as I've already been saying during this show, is like now, most average Christians didn't care, just like most people aren't watching the show. Most people don't care, all right? They simply showed up to the local church unless it got weird. Right? If the local church, priest seems normal, bishop seems normal, I'm going to this church. It's not like they had cars and airplanes. All right? So the majority were normies. Majorities were Melkites, whatever was illegal. that means the majority was Chalcedonian. That's what makes the most sense. And we simply don't have real demographic evidence that the majority were non-Chalcedonian. You can't take a riot of 3,000 people when today the majority aren't rioters, right? So you go, oh, there's a riot, that means the majority were this. That's not true now. It's not true then. So I really would personally question scholarship on this point. And I just think common sense dictates most people just really didn't care and went with the official church, whatever was easy. Now, that said, Christides in The Decline of the Melkite Church says, the most conspicuous action by the Copts was the acquisition of a large number of Melkite churches. This was often considered by past scholarship the result of the Arabs' conquerors' interference in favor of the Copts. Most probably, his opinion, some of the Melkite churches were abandoned because of the fight of part of the population of Alexandria. So most probably, and some is really not firm, right? He's giving an estimation. He's like, well, they were just abandoned. But this begs the question, why were they abandoned? Chalcedonian residency was disallowed by the Arabs. So there was certainly some level of persecution that would lead to abandonment. Abandonment implies a refugee crisis. Why did Chalcedonians leave if not for Muslim persecutions, right? And if they're permitting, like we already read in an earlier source in Syria, that they are expelling, right? They're expelling the Chalcedonian bishops and they're filling them with Jacobite bishops. That's just what happened in Egypt. Same thing. This isn't they voluntarily left and they never were there and these churches were unpopular. It's due to persecution they left and the church that had imperial favor from the caliphate walked in. That's what makes the most sense. Now, for example, in Mosul, we had 13 churches that became mosque. If we went by the logic of the scholars that their abandonment means there weren't a lot of Chalcedonian Christians, by this logic, there weren't a lot of Christians in those 13 churches in Mosul that became mosque. Now, clearly, those 13 churches being a mosque is a persecution because of ISIS, because of refugee crisis where we've lost a lot of historical Christians of Iraq. That's why those 13 churches became mosque, not because those Christians weren't the majority of those churches beforehand. So same thing. Those Chalcedonians were the majority of the churches that they left. They were expelled, the quote one non-Chalcedonian source, right? They were expelled. They were not allowed residency. There was a refugee crisis and people left because of persecution and fear of reprisal. All right. So clearly we see state persecution as the reason for an increase in non-Chalcedonian taking churches. And once they have the churches, people just show up to the local church. That's how those people over generations became non-Chalcedonians. Now consider this, because I think this evidence very much implies the truthfulness of my thesis. The struggle for the properties of the churches that ended after many centuries has not yet been studied adequately. Frenkel reports that in the 12th century, there were only 2 Melkite churches in Alexandria. 5 Coptic churches were still functioning. So even 500 years later, the proportion was 2 to 5. So after 500 years of the Chalcedonians not having favoritism, right? Though to be fair, there would be the non-Chalcedonians and Chalcedonians would eventually get more of an equal status. Point is, that proportion 500 years later was 2 to 5, right? Especially after 130 years of non-residency, not 1 to 9, right? Like 90% was non-Chalcedonian. It was 2 to 5, 500 years later. So what was it in the year 600 before the Persians came, or 595? It was clearly more Chalcedonian, no doubt about it. I don't think you could make a serious argument that's not appeals to authorities that it was majority non-Chalcedonian, in all honesty. Well, that being said, let's keep going. There was a blunted Chalcedonian comeback when they got some sort of level of legal recognition to have a patriarch. In 742, Caliph al-Hirsam finally allowed Melkite clergy to elect a patriarch on the condition that he would permanently reside in Antioch and have limited contact to the Byzantine emperor. Again, not reasonable if you're a foreign empire. He negotiated with Caliph Hissam the request for the return of several churches. The patriarch also tried to recover the church in Mariut from the monophysites, but these efforts failed. The governor, in the presence of the Melkite patriarch Cosmas and monophysical patriarch Michael I, settled the dispute in favor of the Copts. So even at that later stage, the Chalcedonians couldn't retrieve their own churches. There was, even at later stage, obvious favor for the non-Chalcedonians. I just want to point that out. It's a blunted comeback. They're allowed to exist. Congratulations. But in reality, the non-Chalcedonians were given the favorable treatment among the groups of Christians. Now, I brought up during my debate with Agan that the non-Chalcedonians were a proto-nationalist movement. That's my opinion. I just want to quote one scholar on the question so you could see that I'm not the only person who considers the idea. Was the driving impulse behind non-Chalcedonianism, local sovereignty, and then under Persians and Islam, anti-Romanism? Some researchers claim that this doctrinal dispute was one of the attempts to free Syrian Egypt from the rule of Constantinople. It is possible that monophysitism overlapped the movement of rebirth of Eastern cultures directed against the domination of Greek civilization. Right, so we have that idea repeated there. Now, let's draw some conclusions, and if there's audience questions, you could begin asking them, because this is very dense, and I couldn't really go into everything people are talking about. So ask respectful questions, and we can answer a few. Conclusions we could draw. Among non-Chalcedonians, only the Armenians and Ethiopians, aside from Copt metropolitans until the 20th century and some non-Chalcedonian fusions, arguably have synods which originated canonically. Non-Chalcedonians were, in my estimation, a minority, with only 2 Severian or court groups out of a total of 6 non-Chalcedonian groups eventually gaining precedent. Syrian Orthodox originate in Jacob Baradai, assuming novel direct jurisdiction, a papalist heresy, creating a new synod, and his followers electing a fake patriarch. All of the Syrian synod's origins are from bishops whose consecrations rendered them invalid. Alexandrian synod's origins are from a single canonical bishop with 2 invalid bishops. Consecration apart from the canonical synod renders all consecrations invalid. A crucial non-Chalcedonian contemporary, John of Ephesus, admits this. And Fetha Neges, the Ethiopian Orthodox canon law, is explicitly the same with priestly ordinations and shares the same episcopal prohibitions. John of Ephesus, Michael the Syrian, and Pseudo-Zachariah of Mytilene all preserve the slur Synodites, and these are many centuries removed Oriental Orthodox sources. And this is a tacit admission of the Chalcedonians' canonical legitimacy. They're being name-called the fact that they have synods that are canonical. The violation of Canons 13 and 19 of Antioch, right, which talks about null episcopal consecrations, renders the entire Oriental Orthodox episcopacy among the Egyptians and Syrians not only to judgment, but nullified. In other words, Oriental Orthodox technically and canonically have the form of holy orders, but not actual canonical holy orders. Do they have the charism of a holy order? Only God knows. People aren't going to like this, but St. Hippolytus says that those who were confessors of the faith didn't have to be consecrated priests, though they still had to be consecrated, confessors still had to be consecrated bishops. So imagine that for a second. You didn't need a bishop to consecrate a priest because it's a confessor of the faith. The Holy Spirit provided the charism of being a priest. So we have saints that admit this and say this was an apostolic tradition. So I'm not going to stand in for God and say that every Oriental Orthodox clergyman lacks any sort of charism and lacks holy orders. And we know in the past, like with Novatians, which would have fell under the same canonical violations, though they exist before these canonical violations, they were received back in the church without reconsecrations. So I'm not going to stand in for God. I'm just going to say, technically and canonically, they don't have holy orders. Their holy orders are void and null. That's what the canon state. That's how even non-Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonian canon law interprets those canons. But I'm not going to make the judgment for God. I'm working as a historian in this video, and I am just telling you what the sources say, what the canon state. The assertion that Muslim persecution didn't favor non-Chalcedonian ascendancy is inconsistent with Muslim and non-Chalcedonian sources, and the prevention of patriarchal elections among Chalcedonians to weaken them. The Oriental Orthodox as a movement today only crystallized into a local majority in Egypt and a plurality in the Levant as a result of official recognition from Muslim authorities, absorbing Chalcedonians as the normal alternative to weird groups like, I'm sure, the Gainites, and other non-Chalcedonian groups declining over time because under Muslim persecution, there was strength in numbers. You didn't want to all be splintered, even if you felt the difference of Chalcedonianism was kind of important or Julianism was kind of important. Eventually, it's about survival, and they consolidated themselves. So the non-Chalcedonian schism is tragic. Aggression, mob action, and government persecution occurred on both sides, as we discussed. Both sides. But both sides. It's not just the Chalcedonians. The Persians and Islam were God's judgment, in my opinion, that we were not acting like Christians, right? The differences in Chalcedon weren't being treated in a Christian manner. And this cascaded and spiraled out of control, and it's left a big mess. And God rose up enemies to Christianity, and we've never regained what we've lost. The first great schism is with the non-Chalcedonianism. So I want apologists to be mindful of this, that we're talking about the things of God. And even in disagreement, we need to be fair with one another, and we need to act like Christians, or we will provoke God's judgment. Whether you're Chalcedonian, whether you're Roman Catholic, whether you're non-Chalcedonian, whether you're Protestant, we will provoke God's judgment if we don't deal even with our disagreements as Christians. There may be more untranslated works on these questions of canonicity. I don't claim to be the absolute scholar and expert in this, but from the academic sources I'm reading, I'm really not sure if there is, quite frankly. I would welcome to learn more, but you might find this video is pretty concise in covering all the topics at issue. Chalcedonian Christology, you should be aware, from neutral secular scholarship, is recognized as conceptually Severian. Right? There's people say, well, there's really not a difference here. Severians wrote the definition in Chalcedon. We just covered that the person who wrote the Tome of Leo was the person tasked with coming up the response in Nestorius. So to claim that Leo is then Nestorian really seems totally out of context. The historical context shows that the Western Cyril recognized dyophysite theological vocabulary. It's in Ephesus. It's in the document of John Cassian that was created in order to lead up to the Council of Rome for their work with Cyril against Nestorius. History demands a charitable reading of Leo's tome in Chalcedon. We're saying use no common sense at all. Maybe Leo had a later fall or something, but history demands a charitable reading. We have to try to understand this consistent with their earlier actions. That's what makes sense. The former's Christology, Leo, was in response to Nestorius. And the latter, Chalcedon, was written by Cyrilians, as I already stated. So I ask you this then. With Chalcedon written by Cyrilians, with Leo against Nestorius, is this schism, with all the canonical violations, is it worth it? That's my personal opinion. Is this really worth it? Should we be divided over this? There should be steps for repentance and reconciliation. These should be taken. And past wrong should be addressed. People should owe up to what they did wrong in the past. And we should try not to continue those things that are wrong, canonical, violence, and other things in the future. I hope for a continued interaction in a positive spirit for that reason. And hopefully this video will be a great resource for people. And the sources that I cite in this video will be a great resource for people. And I want to end with a problem, and it's on my side. The Oriental Orthodox are being communed by the Eastern Orthodox, just like the Roman Catholics were in 1800s Russia. I want to say this because I don't want people to freak out when they find out this stuff actually exists and it happens. For any clergymen that see this, I want you to consider their holy orders are void. So how could these people really have right baptisms? They were never baptized by priests. I guess they're all emergency baptisms. They have the form of baptism, certainly. And in that event, should we be so easily communing their laity? It's not just the Antiochians, guys. Not just the Antiochians, not just the OCA. This is a big problem, but maybe we need to go at this at a different angle. Not like, oh, we have a lot of things in common, but rather, do they even have holy orders that aren't void and null? Because I think if we went from that angle, you're going to find no debate, no serious debate anyway. You're going to sadly get maybe personal attacks against me, but I don't think there's a good document in the canonical case that their holy orders are authentic. And there's huge ramifications of this. How about the true Orthodox? They're right on the calendar question, but do they follow the canons and have a majority of a synod to accept their consecrations? Do they have the acceptance of the metropolitan or patriarch? Are they appointing bishops within their own jurisdiction? That becomes a major problem. So here you have a whole movement that claims to be defending true orthodoxy, the correct orthodoxy, traditional orthodoxy, but the ecclesiology is non-canonical. So that is something that you need to consider. One moment. So a lot of ramifications of this that are very important that are previously. All right. So right before we get into audience questions, I want to encourage people. If this has blessed you in the spirit of Lent and in giving alms, please support the church in Cambodia. We have 3 different missionaries now in Phnom Penh. We're looking for volunteers for the summer and the fall to be missionaries in Cambodia. Please pray and consider becoming a missionary. Of course, you'll need a blessing. You could become a missionary at orthomission.com, and you can reach out to me there or on Discord or wherever. But the point is, if you can't be a missionary yourself, then support the mission through your prayers, through PayPal, monthly contributors. Patreon is below, Venmo, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, and you could support the mission in Cambodia and help make Cambodia a Christian country, an Orthodox Christian country. That is something that if we're doing all of this and we don't care about doing missionary work, then what's the point of all this theology? So whether you're non-Chalcedonian, Chalcedonian, whatever you are, this has blessed you. Please support the Church of Cambodia at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Help the evangelism there. And I want to share one thing before I do audience questions, because I think we have a few good audience questions. There's a couple beautiful icons, which will eventually go to a donor. Hand-painted icon from our Cambodian iconographer. This is just absolutely beautiful. Hopefully theophanyworks.com will work on making where they can mass print these. Just absolutely gorgeous icon. And an icon of our Lord. I think the Theotokos in the Lord is my favorite, but just absolutely beautiful icons. He has the blessing of the Metropolitan of Singapore to do these icons, and we should definitely support his work. And so this is great. So again, it's blessed you, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. Links are below. Monthly contributors, Patreon, much appreciated. Oh, and your prayers. We're getting much closer to having the not-for-profit set up. Please pray for that. That'd be very much appreciated. So we have this. Union must only happen in Orthodox Church, not a false union. Of course, we don't want false unions. We have actually respect you, Craig, as a non-Eastern Orthodox person. Your insistence on missionary work is awesome. Thank you so much. I mean, why else are we doing this? We're not doing this for God. I really wonder. I lose money doing this. I lose money and tons of time. And in fact, it's a family effort at this point. Like all of us, the whole Saturday, I'm doing this almost now. It's 2.5 hours. Whole Saturday is affected by liturgy and then doing this. But again, I can't be the only one doing this. And what are we doing this for? You're a Christian. You got to give up your life for Christ. He gave up his life for you. And I commend you wherever you are, serve him. So some audience questions. What is the chance, in your view, of the current dialogues between World Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox leading to a unified agreed confession? I think we're at a ebb right now for that. It's not really going too well. I think dialogues are good because we should be trying to hammer out theological differences. But the problem is, and this is from Satan, is that it's good to hammer theological differences. And so Satan tries to take something good and pervert it and makes people, including jurisdictions, start communing the non-Chalcedonians because, oh, well, we have agreements, so we're not that much in disagreement, which isn't true. Which isn't true. See, I'm hoping, like what Subdeacon Daniel Kakish does, what I do, to have a difference of opinion, but in love and sincerity, but like marked difference will be a more successful means of working through these disputes. But I just think the truth is so clearly on the Chalcedonian side here with the canons. We've dealt with Christology that hopefully with Western converts, they will become Chalcedonian, and we will get the actual desire of the faithful among them if they realize there's a problem with their holy orders, that no, we really got to fix this. This is serious, because yes, it is serious. We have, if Oriental Orthodox not canonical because of these violations, won't the modern day Eastern Orthodox church also be examined by the same standard? Of course, which is why there's this issue with Ukraine and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine versus Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The former, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OCU, is kind of a new creation with single ordinations, ecumenical patriarch. We do have issues, and this is actually a point of schism today, local schism, that is, precisely because of what he deal with, the fact that we might be dealing with bishops with void holy orders. You know, I'm not one of those OCD people that think it's going to end the world. And what I mean by that, it's like the Ethiopian Synod. There's always going to be a few people that somehow cheated the system and screwed things up. And God's bigger than that. And, you know, God has means of correcting that. But yes, you know, it is a problem, and Eastern Orthodox must be absolutely held to the same standard. We have, given Rocor's reunion of the MP, would the various diaspora areas where Rocor still exists be technical canonical violations? It depends. If Rocor were to exist within, let's say, a place that already has a jurisdiction and not with official permission, because, you know, you could have a monastery in Jerusalem and not be Jerusalem Patriarchate, obviously, and stuff like that. But Rocor is in a lot of places that are considered heathen lands canonically, and so they would have every right to exist. In fact, I'll have a community post coming up on this. My hot take is the majority of the synod was Rocor, not MP, when MP had a patriarch. And so MP only actually became regularized when they went in reunion with Rocor, not the other way around. If you understand the canons, I mean, that'd be a very interesting conversation. Someone wants to debate me on it. But I think Rocor was the canonical Russian church in reality. So that's something to consider. Basically, all the USA is one giant canonical violation. Not quite. USA is treated as heathen lands, but it's a joke, obviously. We have enough Orthodox here. We should have our own church. Craig, it would be great if you could respond to the MP question. Oh, we just did. So there we go. Responding to an earlier comment. In Craig's other live video, I learned from the comments that only Constable recognized Alexandria's claim to all Africa 100 years ago. I would push back a little bit. I really, you know, obviously greatly respect Father. But that being said, the Russians themselves would recognize the Patriarch of Alexandria. So until there's schism. So like if they're elsewhere in Africa and they're recognizing the Patriarch of Alexandria as a patriarch, that shows at least some level of recognition, in my opinion. How is it possible for native bishops to die unless they choose not to ordain new bishops? Good point. Simple enough. Book recommendations, just use the ones I cited. Those are the ones I read. How would a union between Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox realistically happen? We need the dialogues for the theological questions. I think we need guys like Subdeacon Daniel Kakish and I working on the popular ends with the people. And ultimately, I think we need bishops to really hammer out what I'm talking about here, canonical validity. It's not going to work without hammering that out. And I think really canonical validity might be the key that unlocks the whole thing. If half their church and the most important half is not canonical, then what are they doing right now? What are they doing? What's the point? Right? If their bishops are null and void and they're not real patriarchs, well, then what are they doing here? And you would hope the faithful among those people, even if God gives them the charism, because again, I'm not God, I don't make that judgment, would at least care canonically, this is a problem, we got to fix this, because we still apply these canons ourselves. So that's worth saying. Have you looked into the Moscow Patriarch revocation of anathemas against all believers? Not really, actually. That's I would love to understand that, and like their kind of about face on Moscow 1666. There's issues there. It's still something I'm researching, and I don't think I'll have an answer anytime soon, to be honest. Let's see. We might not have much more, and I get to call it a day at that point. I live in Vietnam and go to Cambodia quite often. Where we have, I just saw Father Stanislav from Ho Chi Minh City. So I hope you attended one of the Orthodox churches there, and certainly go to St. George's or St. Pantaleon in Synodville. And so, yeah, it would be great to have you, and regards from Cambodia, from my Cambodian friends, I'm sure. If you look to the history of the Georgian Orthodox Church, I would say with the Armenians and the Georgians, some of the stuff that there were non-Chalcedonians kind of overblown, quite frankly. So long story short, I haven't looked at too much history because there's not a lot of Georgian sources in English. I read more the hagiographies, and a little it does come up. I'm not too concerned. I don't think there's many difficulties posed by that. Would the Ukraine issue be solved by the EPGOC revoking the Tomos? I would say so. And I think also, being that the Canonical Church, UOC, already declared their own autocephaly anyway, and the world's jurisdictions other than Moscow recognize it, it's just, we already have an autocephalous church that's canonical, actually. So it's just, it would be waiting for the Moscow Church to give consent. And see, this is the issue that breaking the canons creates. OCU is a false state-run church, is filled with deposed priests and bishops, and that is a real issue. So we got to follow the canons. We definitely have to follow the canons. And yeah, we have people, some of the Ethiopian bros. We are one. I think he's saying that the Eritreans and the Ethiopians are one church, and I don't know. I don't know enough of that issue where I'm going to give an opinion, but the Ethiopian church is cool with me. I think they're cool. So that's pretty much it today. I really hope you like this video. You have to like it now. Get this video in other people's hair. Share this video. Click subscribe. There's no one else doing this much, this concise a presentation, this many sources, dealing with the really important issues, dealing with it dispassionately. Please subscribe to this video, and don't forget to support the mission in Cambodia, because for me to do videos like this, it takes more time to put them together. I can't do as many videos. So share this video, and don't forget to support the Church of Cambodia. Patreon below for monthly subscribers. PayPal, Venmo, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. And most of all, become a missionary yourself. We need a missionary volunteer for the summer and for the fall. So orthomission.com, Prophet Daniel Missionary Movement. We're bringing it to North America. We're starting the not-for-profit paperwork. You become a missionary. Put your faith into practice. We should be giving alms and doing good works here during Lent, saving our souls. Thank you so much. And I will end the show by quoting Jesus Rock by saying, as always, fight to death for the truth. And the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.